I walked into the briefing room, and my wife's dad, the SEAL Admiral, smirked. "What's your call sign, Princess?" The men laughed. I said, "Reaper Zero." His face went white. He knew exactly who I was. Look, I've been in some pretty uncomfortable situations in my life. I've flown blind through sandstorms where the visibility was measured in good luck seeing your own hand. I've had my helicopter shot at by people who really didn't want me there. And I once had to sit through a 4-hour presentation about military budgeting that made waterboarding sound like a spa treatment. But walking into that Navy briefing room in San Diego on a Tuesday morning that smelled like burned coffee and decades-old testosterone, that was a special kind of hell that no amount of combat training could have prepared me for. The room was packed, 40 officers, give or take, all wearing their dress whites like they were auditioning for a recruitment poster. The air conditioning was broken, naturally, because the Navy apparently believes that sweating builds character. Every single one of these guys had that look. You know the one. I've seen some stuff, mixed with, I'm about to mansplain tactical operations to anyone who'll listen expression. And standing at the head of the table, looking like he owned not just the room, but possibly the entire Pacific Fleet, was Admiral Conrad Rains. My father-in-law. The man who signed my wedding photos with the enthusiasm of someone endorsing their own death certificate. Now, here's the thing about Conrad. He's what you'd call old military. Not the good kind that respects tradition and honor, but the kind that thinks anyone who didn't serve in Vietnam is basically a Boy Scout playing dress-up. He's the type who measures a man's worth by how many push-ups he can do and how loud he can yell "Hoo-yah" without his voice cracking. And me? Well, I'm the civilian who married his daughter, which in his mind makes me roughly as useful as a screen door on a submarine. I'd been invited to this briefing, and yes, I'm using air quotes so aggressive they could punch through drywall, because apparently someone in the chain of command thought it would be a great idea for civilian aviation consultants to observe naval operations. Translation: they needed to fill a diversity quota, and I happened to be breathing and nearby. The invitation email had been so passive-aggressive it practically came with a side of eye roll. Your presence is requested but not required, as we understand civilian schedules can be flexible. Yeah, real subtle there, Lieutenant whoever wrote that. When I walked in, exactly 3 people looked up. 2 of them immediately looked back down at their phones, and the third, some fresh-faced lieutenant who probably still got carded at bars, gave me the kind of once-over that said, "Who's this guy? And did he wander in from the Starbucks next door?" I was wearing khakis and a polo shirt because, newsflash, I'm not active duty anymore, and I'll be damned if I'm going to dress like I'm attending a funeral for fun. Conrad, naturally, clocked me immediately. His eyes tracked me across the room like a predator watching a particularly unimpressive gazelle stumble into his territory. I found a seat in the back, because I'm not an idiot, and I know how this works, and tried to make myself as invisible as possible, which lasted about 4 minutes. Conrad was in the middle of some speech about operational readiness and maritime superiority, using enough buzzwords to make a corporate consultant weep with envy, when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. Just stopped. The silence was so abrupt that someone's pen rolling off the table sounded like thunder. He looked directly at me, and I swear I saw the corners of his mouth twitch upward in what I can only describe as the facial expression equivalent of loading a gun. "Before we continue, gentlemen," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that could rust steel, "I think we should welcome our observer. My daughter's husband has decided to grace us with his presence today." The way he said "daughter's husband" made it sound like he was identifying a particularly unfortunate rash. He's here to learn how real naval operations work. The room did that thing where everyone tries not to laugh, but absolutely is laughing, resulting in a chorus of coughs, snorts, and poorly disguised snickers that would have made a middle school classroom proud. One guy in the front row actually had tears in his eyes from trying to hold it in. Real professional guys. Top-tier military discipline right there. Conrad wasn't done, though. Oh no, he was just warming up, like a stand-up comedian who'd spotted a heckler and decided to absolutely destroy them for the next 10 minutes. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the table in a power pose that probably looked intimidating to people who weren't, actually intimidated. "So tell me," he said, and I could already feel where this train was headed, and also that there were no brakes and possibly no tracks. "What's your call sign, Princess?" "Princess." He actually said princess. In a room full of naval officers. About a grown man. His son-in-law. The laughter that erupted wasn't just loud. It was the kind of full-bodied, slap-your-knee, nearly choking on your own spit laughter that you usually only hear when someone falls spectacularly on their face at a wedding. These guys were eating it up like it was the funniest thing they'd heard since someone accidentally called the Admiral Mom during roll call. Even the serious-looking commander in the corner who'd been frowning at his tablet like it owed him money cracked a smile. I sat there for a moment, letting the laughter wash over me like the world's most obnoxious wave pool. I could have gotten angry. I could have walked out. I could have done a lot of things. But here's what you learn when you've actually been in the situations these guys only brief about. Timing is everything. So I smiled. Just once. A small, knowing smile that probably looked friendly enough but carried the emotional weight of a freight train about to derail directly through someone's ego. Then I stood up, slowly, making sure every single person in that room was looking at me. The laughter started to die down, not because they were done finding it funny, but because something about the way I moved made their monkey brains go, wait, hold up. Is this about to get interesting? I looked Conrad Rains dead in his steel-gray eyes, the ones that had probably stared down foreign adversaries and congressional committees with equal disdain, and I said two words that I knew would detonate like a tactical nuke in that room. Reaper Zero. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute, suffocating silence that happens when reality walks into a room and bitch slaps everyone across the face simultaneously. You could have heard a pin drop, except nobody was breathing enough to risk dropping anything. 40 officers, every single one of them, just froze. Some with their mouths still open from laughing. Some with coffee cups halfway to their lips. One guy's pen literally fell from his hand and clattered onto the table, and even that sound seemed too loud. Commander Hill, who I'd noticed earlier because he had enough ribbons on his chest to gift wrap a small car, went completely pale. His eyes went wide, and he leaned toward Conrad and whispered, loud enough for half the room to hear, because apparently whispering is a lost art. Sir? The Reaper? The one from Icevale. Conrad's face did something I'd never seen before and honestly hoped to never see again. It went from smug satisfaction to complete shock to something that looked suspiciously like horror, all in about 2 seconds. The blood literally drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked like a fish that had just realized it was actually on a boat and not in the ocean like it had previously assumed. I stayed standing, keeping my expression neutral and friendly, because the beautiful thing about dropping a verbal bomb is you don't have to follow it up with anything. The bomb does all the work. The room stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 seconds, long enough for every single officer present to mentally rifle through their service knowledge and connect the dots between Reaper Zero and that absolutely insane mission everyone heard about, but nobody talks about, because it's classified 6 ways to Sunday. One lieutenant in the back, couldn't have been older than 25, made a choking sound like he'd just swallowed his own tongue. Another officer dropped his folder, and the papers scattered across the floor with all the dramatic flair of a movie scene. Nobody moved to pick them up. They were all too busy staring at me like I'd just announced I was secretly an alien or possibly Batman. Conrad finally found his voice, though it came out about an octave higher than his usual authoritative boom. "You're that's." He cleared his throat, tried again. "That was you." I nodded once, still smiling that small, pleasant smile that was absolutely murdering him from the inside out. "Yes, sir. That was me. Icevale. February 2019. You might remember it. You ordered the mission despite the abort recommendation. Your SEAL team needed extraction. I was the one who brought them home." I paused, let that sink in for just a heartbeat. All of them. Through a Category 5 Arctic storm. In the dark. With a helicopter that had no business flying in those conditions. The room remained dead silent. Someone's phone buzzed, probably a text message, and the sound made 3 people actually jump. Conrad just stared at me, and I watched in real time as his brain recalculated everything he thought he knew about me. The useless civilian. The guy who married his daughter. The man he'd just called princess in front of 40 subordinates. And in that moment, watching his face cycle through every stage of regret, realization, and raw embarrassment, I had one crystal clear thought that made this entire awkward, sweaty briefing room experience completely worth it. This was going to be fun. Let me tell you about my wife, Talia Rains, because understanding her is basically required reading for understanding why her father is the way he is, and why I've spent the last 3 years of my life feeling like I'm in some kind of extended job interview that I can't actually fail out of, but also can't pass. Talia is what you'd call intimidating in the best possible way. She's 5'7" of pure confidence wrapped in designer clothes and a smile that could either make you feel like the most important person in the world or make you question every life decision that led you to this exact moment. I've seen her walk into a bar packed wall-to-wall with Marines, and I'm talking about the kind of jarheads who bench press small vehicles for fun and silence the entire room just by raising one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Not saying a word, just the eyebrow. It was like watching a superpower activate in real time. She works in corporate law, the kind where she wears power suits that cost more than my first car and casually drops phrases like fiduciary responsibility and litigation strategy, while I'm still trying to figure out if I paid the electric bill on time. She's brilliant, funny, doesn't take crap from anyone, and has this way of making you feel like you're the only person in the room, even when there are 200 other people around. When we met at that veteran fundraiser 3 years ago, I thought she was completely out of my league. Turns out I was right, but she married me anyway, which either speaks to my incredible charm or her questionable judgment. I'm going to go with charm because it makes me feel better about myself. But here's the kicker. Despite being this absolute force of nature, who could probably negotiate world peace before lunch and still have time to destroy someone in a courtroom by dinner, she has not been able to convince her father that I'm not completely useless. And believe me, she's tried. I've heard the conversations. I've been in the room during family dinners where she's literally listed my accomplishments like she's presenting evidence to a jury, and Conrad just sits there nodding politely while internally categorizing me somewhere between houseplant and unfortunate furniture. To Admiral Conrad Rains, I am and have always been that civilian guy who married my daughter. That's it. That's the entire sum of my existence in his universe. Never mind that I have a master's degree in aeronautical engineering. Never mind that I spent 12 years in active service. Never mind that I have more flight hours than most commercial pilots will see in their entire careers. Nope. I'm just the guy who showed up one day, somehow tricked his daughter into marrying me, probably through witchcraft or blackmail. He's still investigating, and now I exist in his peripheral vision like an annoying pop-up ad he can't quite close. Here's a fun example. Remember Operation Icevale? The mission I dropped on him like a conversational grenade in that briefing room? Yeah, well, here's the part one didn't mention. The SEAL team I extracted during that nightmare mission? Conrad's team. He was the commanding officer who ordered that operation. I flew through what meteorologists were calling unsurvivable conditions to pull out 15 of his men, including his second-in-command, who was currently experiencing what medical professionals call actively dying from hypothermia. I brought every single one of them home. Not a scratch. Well, except for Jenkins, my co-pilot, who bit through his lower lip from clenching his jaw so hard during the approach that he needed stitches. But that's beside the point. Conrad sent me a commendation letter. A really nice one, actually. It called me a credit to naval aviation and praised my extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. I still have it somewhere in a box in the garage, probably underneath some old tax returns and a broken blender I keep meaning to fix. But here's the thing. He sent that letter to Major Lucas Vaughn, call sign Reaper Zero. He had no idea that 5 years later, Major Lucas Vaughn would be sitting across from him at Thanksgiving dinner, married to his daughter, being asked if I wanted white meat or dark meat while he made pointed comments about civilians who don't understand sacrifice. The disconnect is so absurd it would be funny if it wasn't my actual life. This man pinned a medal on my chest. Well, not literally. It was mailed for saving his team's lives, and now he can't remember my first name half the time. At our wedding reception, he introduced me to someone as Tyler. My name is Lucas. I've been married to his daughter for 3 years. We have Sunday dinner together twice a month. Tyler. I didn't even correct him because at that point, what's the point? Let him think I'm Tyler. Maybe Tyler gets more respect. At home, Talia tries to smooth things over because she's an eternal optimist who apparently believes that enough time and exposure will eventually warm her father up to me. Like I'm some kind of emotional leftovers that just need a few minutes in the microwave. She'll curl up next to me on the couch, usually after another dinner where Conrad spent 45 minutes talking about naval operations while pointedly not asking me about my day, and she'll say something like, "Babe, Dad just has old-school humor. He doesn't mean anything by it." And I'll look at her, this woman I love more than anything, and reply, "Yeah, 1800s school humor. Like, pre-electricity old school. Pre-indoor plumbing old school." She'll laugh, do that thing where she scrunches her nose that makes my heart do stupid gymnastics, and then she'll kiss my cheek and tell me not to cause a scene. Which is rich, because I don't cause scenes. Scenes cause themselves around me. I'm just standing there, existing, and suddenly everything's on fire, and I'm holding the matches without knowing how they got in my hand. But here's where it gets really good, or really bad, depending on your perspective and how much you enjoy watching human relationships implode in slow motion. Conrad doesn't just think I'm useless. He actively tells people I'm useless. At a 4th of July barbecue last summer, I overheard him talking to some captain buddy of his by the grill. They were doing that thing men do where they drink beer and pretend they're not gossiping, but they're absolutely gossiping. Conrad was flipping burgers with the confidence of a man who's never had one turn out dry, and he said, and I quote because this is burned into my brain like a brand, "My daughter married a nice enough guy, but he's never really done anything, you know? Civilian work. Consulting. Whatever that means. Whatever that means." I was standing about 15 feet away, holding a bowl of potato salad that Talia had asked me to bring outside, just frozen in place like a deer in headlights. The captain, to his credit, looked uncomfortable and mumbled something non-committal before quickly excusing himself to go check on his kids in the pool. Kids who were very clearly fine and needed zero checking on, but I appreciated the exit strategy. I didn't say anything, didn't confront him, just put the potato salad on the table, smiled when Talia asked if everything was okay, and spent the rest of the afternoon mentally composing resignation letters to this family that I would never actually send, because I love my wife too much to let her dad's opinion ruin what we have. But man, it stung. Still stings, if I'm being honest. The worst part is that Conrad isn't even trying to be malicious. That's what kills me. He's not sitting around twirling a mustache and plotting ways to make me feel small. He genuinely believes that civilian life is less than, that anyone who isn't currently serving or didn't serve for 30+ years is basically playing at life while the real adults handle the important stuff. It's not personal, except it is personal, because I'm married to his daughter, and every time he dismisses me, he's also dismissing her choice to be with me. Talia knows this, by the way. She's not naive. She sees what's happening, and it bothers her more than she lets on. I've caught her staring at her dad during dinners with this look of frustration mixed with sadness, like she's watching someone she loves refuse to open a gift she carefully wrapped. But she also loves her father, respects him despite his flaws, and doesn't want to be the person who forces an ultimatum. So she stays hopeful, keeps inviting me to family functions, keeps trying to build bridges between two men who are standing on opposite sides of a canyon, shouting into the void. And me? I kept showing up, kept smiling, kept being polite, kept swallowing every dismissive comment, every forgotten name, every time he talked over me at dinner or changed the subject when I mentioned my work. I kept it all inside, packed it down, because that's what you do when you love someone. You endure their difficult family members. You play the long game. You hope that eventually, something will shift. Spoiler alert, something shifted. In that briefing room, when I said Reaper Zero, and watched 40 officers realize that the princess their admiral had just mocked was actually the legend they'd all heard whispered about in ready rooms and officer clubs. When Conrad's face went from smug to shocked to something approaching horror as he connected the dots between the decorated pilot he'd commended and the son-in-law he'd spent 3 years treating like an intern who wouldn't shut up about their study abroad semester. Yeah, the scene definitely caused itself. And honestly, I didn't even feel bad about it. 5 years ago, I was Major Lucas Vaughn, and if that name meant anything to you, it meant you either worked in tactical aviation or you'd heard the stories that get passed around at bars when the beer's been flowing and someone inevitably says, "You think that's crazy? Let me tell you about this one time." My call sign was Reaper Zero, which sounds metal as hell and absolutely was intentional, because when you're flying missions that make insurance adjusters weep, you might as well own the aesthetic. I was a combat pilot specializing in tactical extractions, which is military speak for We need you to fly into places that God himself has marked as return to sender and pull our people out before they become international incidents. I wasn't special forces, wasn't a SEAL, wasn't one of those guys who kicks down doors with night vision goggles and enough weaponry to arm a small nation. I was the guy who got those guys out when everything went sideways, which, spoiler alert, is pretty much always. My job was to fly helicopters into situations where the phrase, "that's impossible," was less of a warning and more of a challenge I took personally. Mountains and zero visibility? Sure. Active combat zones where people were actively trying to turn my bird into expensive confetti? Why not? Sandstorms that could strip paint off a tank? Just another Tuesday. The mission that made my call sign legendary, the one that got whispered about in ready rooms and officer clubs like some kind of modern military folklore, was Operation Icevale. And let me tell you, that mission earned its name because Operation We're All Gonna Die Screaming apparently didn't pass the PR review. It happened in February 2019, in the Arctic Circle, which for those of you who've never had the pleasure, is exactly as miserable as it sounds, but somehow worse. Imagine the coldest you've ever been. Then multiply that by, why do humans even live here? And add a generous helping of the wind is physically angry at your existence. A Navy SEAL team had been inserted for what was supposed to be a quick reconnaissance operation. In and out. No drama. Everyone home for dinner. Except intelligence had massively underestimated the number of hostiles in the area, which is military speak for, we screwed up and now people might die because of it. The team got pinned down, ran through most of their ammunition trying to fight their way to the extraction point, and then Mother Nature decided to join the party by dropping a blizzard on them that meteorologists were calling historic and unsurvivable in the same breath. I was stationed at a forward operating base about 200 miles away, sitting in the mess hall eating what the military generously called meatloaf, but what I suspected was actually recycled sadness when the alert came through. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Hendricks, who was about 5'2" of pure concentrated authority and could make grown men cry with a single disappointed look, called an emergency briefing. The room filled up fast, every pilot on base crowding in because when the colonel calls an emergency meeting, you show up and you show up fast. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Wind speeds are hitting 120 miles per hour. Visibility is 0. Temperature is -40 and dropping. They have maybe 6 hours of shelter left before hypothermia starts taking them out one by one. The room went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet where people are thinking hard about solutions, but the bad kind where everyone's doing mental math and arriving at the same conclusion. This is a suicide mission. Someone in the back, I think it was Captain Morrison, guy who flew supply runs and had never seen combat, actually laughed nervously and said, "You're joking, right? We can't fly in that." Colonel Hendricks just stared at him until he physically shrank in his seat. "I'm not asking for volunteers," she said flatly. "I'm asking for pilots who can do the impossible." Her eyes scanned the room and landed on me. "Vaughn, you've flown in worse." Had I flown in worse? Debatable. Had I flown in anything remotely close to this level of meteorological insanity? Also debatable. But here's the thing about being the guy with a reputation. You can't suddenly develop common sense when people are counting on you. It's bad for morale and worse for your ego. So I stood up, stretched like I was about to go for a casual Sunday drive instead of potentially dying in a frozen Hell's Cape, and said, "Good news, Colonel. I'm terrible at following advice, and literally everyone's advice right now is don't do this." A few people laughed. Nervous laughter, the kind you hear at funerals when someone tells an inappropriate joke and everyone's too uncomfortable not to react. Colonel Hendricks almost smiled, which from her was basically the equivalent of a standing ovation. "You'll have Jenkins as your co-pilot," she said, nodding toward Lieutenant Danny Jenkins, who was standing near the front looking like he'd just been told he won a prize, but the prize was a one-way ticket to hell. Jenkins was a good pilot, solid under pressure, had a wife and 2 kids back in Virginia, and pictures of them taped inside his locker like a shrine to better life choices. He looked at me with eyes that said, "Please tell me you have a plan." I looked back with eyes that said, "Absolutely not. We're winging this." Because honestly, that was the truth. You don't plan for the impossible. You just point your helicopter at it and hope physics is feeling generous. The flight prep took 45 minutes. We loaded the bird with every cold weather survival kit we could strap down, extra fuel tanks, because we weren't sure what the return trip would look like, and enough medical supplies to run a small field hospital. The crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Ramirez who'd seen more combat than most people see in video games, pulled me aside as we were doing final checks. "Sir," he said, and I could tell from his tone this wasn't going to be a pep talk. "You don't have to do this. Nobody would blame you for walking away." I tightened the last strap on my harness and looked at him. 15 guys are about to freeze to death because someone's intelligence report was wrong. If I don't go, they die knowing we didn't even try. I can live with a lot of things, Ramirez, but I can't live with that. He nodded slowly, clapped me on the shoulder hard enough to bruise, and said, "Bring him home, Reaper." The flight out started rough and got exponentially worse with every mile. Jenkins spent the first 30 minutes running through system checks and weather updates, his voice steady and professional even though I could see his hands shaking slightly on the controls. By the time we hit the storm front, visibility dropped to literally nothing, just white, endless white, like flying through the inside of a ping-pong ball. The wind hit us like getting sucker-punched by a giant, and the helicopter started shaking so hard I was genuinely concerned parts were going to start falling off. "This is insane," Jenkins said, not panicking, just stating a fact like he was commenting on the weather, which technically he was. "We can't see anything. Instruments are going crazy. We're flying blind." "Then it's a good thing I have trust issues with instruments," I shot back, fighting the controls as another gust tried to flip us sideways. "We're navigating by faith, spite, and whatever divine entity finds this entertaining." Jenkins actually laughed at that, a slightly hysterical edge to it. "I'm praying so hard right now," he said. "Like, so hard that God's probably telling me to quiet down because I'm being annoying." "Keep praying," I told him. "But also keep your hands on those controls because if I pass out from stress, you're flying this thing home." We flew for 90 minutes through conditions that would have made professional stunt pilots quit and become accountants. The helicopter handled like a shopping cart with 3 broken wheels. The instruments were throwing errors like it was their job, and I was navigating based on gut feeling and the occasional glimpse of terrain features when the wind would part the snow for half a second. Jenkins stopped talking after the first hour, which was fine because I needed all my concentration anyway. I could hear him breathing, though, fast and shallow, and I knew he was running through all the ways this could go wrong in his head. When we finally found them, it was less tactical precision and more, thank God we didn't fly into a mountain. The SEAL team had taken shelter in a shallow ravine, and I could barely make out their heat signatures through the storm. Landing was out of the question. The ground was uneven and visibility was basically a suggestion. So I had to hover, which in these conditions was like trying to balance a pencil on its point during an earthquake while someone throws rocks at you. The team leader came through on the radio, voice crackling with static, and what I'm pretty sure was shocked that anyone had actually shown up. "Reaper Zero, is that you? Please tell me you're real and not a hypothermia hallucination." "Oh, I'm real," I replied, fighting to keep the bird steady as wind tried to slam us into the ravine wall. "And I'm also questioning my life choices. Get your people on board, now? We don't have much time before this storm makes the current situation look pleasant." They loaded fast, professionals even when half-frozen and completely exhausted. 15 men, some carrying injured teammates, all moving with the kind of desperate efficiency that comes from knowing this is their only shot. The team leader was the last one on, and as he hauled himself into the bird, he looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and said, "You're either the bravest pilot I've ever met or the craziest." "Why not both?" I said, and pulled up before he could answer, the helicopter clawing for altitude through wind that really didn't want us to leave. The flight back was worse than the flight in, if that was possible. We were heavier, the storm was getting stronger, and my arms felt like I'd been bench pressing the sun for 3 hours straight. Jenkins had progressed from praying quietly to praying out loud, a constant stream of please God, please, that honestly was kind of comforting because it meant he was still conscious. One of the SEALs in the back was in bad shape, medic working on him with the kind of controlled urgency that meant time was running out. We made it back. Barely. I set that helicopter down so hard the landing gear complained, but we were down and everyone was alive, and that was literally all that mattered. The base erupted in cheers, people running toward us from everywhere, and I just sat in the pilot's seat for a minute, hands still gripping the controls, trying to remember how to breathe normally. The SEAL team leader found me later in the debriefing room. Lieutenant Mason Rains, though I didn't know his last name was significant then. He shook my hand so hard I thought he might dislocate my shoulder and said, "You saved our lives. All of us. I don't know how to thank you." I just shrugged, too tired for eloquence. Thank me by staying alive and doing something worth the risk. He died 6 months later. Different mission, different storm. Same commander making the calls, Admiral Conrad Rains. His brother. The universe has a cruel sense of irony sometimes. I met Talia at a veteran fundraiser in downtown San Diego, which is exactly the kind of place you'd expect to meet your future wife if you're the romantic type who believes in fate and destiny and all that Hallmark movie nonsense. I'm not that type, for the record. I'm the type who showed up because my buddy Dave, who I flew with back in the day and who's now working some cushy defense contractor job, guilt me into buying a ticket by saying, "Come on, man, it's for a good cause. Plus there's an open bar and you literally have nothing better to do on a Saturday night." He wasn't wrong about that last part, which stung a little, but the open bar sealed the deal. The event was at this fancy hotel ballroom with crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my annual salary and waiters circulating with tiny appetizers that looked beautiful but left you hungry 5 minutes later. You know the type, a single shrimp on a cracker with some kind of foam that's supposed to be fancy but tastes like expensive air. I was standing near the bar, nursing a whiskey and trying to look like I belonged in a room full of people wearing suits that fit properly, when she walked up next to me and ordered a martini with the kind of confidence that makes bartenders stand up straighter. She was wearing this dark blue dress that probably had a designer name I couldn't pronounce, her dark hair pulled back in a way that showed off cheekbones that could cut glass. And when she glanced at me, I swear the room got quieter. Or maybe that was just my brain short-circuiting. Hard to say. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," she said, a slight smile playing at the corner of her mouth. I laughed, caught off guard by the directness. "That obvious? You've been standing in the same spot for 20 minutes. You haven't touched the appetizers even though the crab cakes are actually decent, and you're drinking whiskey at a wine and champagne event," she said, taking her martini from the bartender with a nod of thanks. "So yeah, pretty obvious." In my defense, I said, the whiskey was a tactical choice. Wine gives me a headache and champagne makes me feel like I'm at a wedding I wasn't invited to. She laughed at that, a genuine laugh that reached her eyes, and extended her hand. Talia Rains, corporate lawyer, champagne enthusiast, and apparently better at reading people than you are at hiding discomfort. I shook her hand, noting that her grip was firm and confident, the kind of handshake that meant business. Lucas Vaughn, former helicopter pilot, whiskey defender, and guilty as charged on the discomfort thing. I paused, then added, "Rains? Any relation to Admiral Conrad Rains?" Her smile dimmed slightly, just a flicker, but I caught it. "He's my father." "You know him?" "Only by reputation," I said, which was technically true. I knew of him. Everyone in naval aviation knew of him, but I'd never met the man personally. Didn't know then that I'd saved his brother's life or that 5 years later he'd be calling me princess in a briefing room. Life's funny that way. We talked for 2 hours. Just talked. About everything and nothing. She told me about her work, the cases she was handling, the frustration of dealing with clients who thought they knew better than their own lawyers. I told her about flying, about the missions I could talk about and the ones I couldn't, about what it's like to transition from military life to civilian consulting where the biggest emergency is someone's PowerPoint not loading correctly. She laughed at my jokes, called me out when I was being self-deprecating, and somewhere around the third drink, I realized I was in serious trouble because this woman was absolutely, completely out of my league, and I was falling for her anyway. "So what does a former combat pilot do at a veteran fundraiser besides hide by the bar?" she asked, swirling her second martini. "Mostly wonder why he didn't fake a stomach illness," I said. "But also, support the cause. Veterans need resources. Transitioning to civilian life is harder than people think. All that important stuff that I genuinely believe in, but that sounds preachy when I say it out loud at a fancy party." She studied me for a moment, head tilted slightly. "You're interesting, Lucas Vaughn. Most guys I meet at these things either try too hard to impress me or spend the whole time talking about themselves. You're doing neither. That's because I'm assuming you're already unimpressed, and I'm just trying to delay the inevitable moment when you remember you have somewhere else to be, I said. Self-deprecating and honest. Dangerous combination. She pulled out her phone, unlocked it, and handed it to me. Put your number in. I want to continue this conversation when we're not surrounded by people in uncomfortable shoes. I took the phone, trying not to look as surprised as I felt, and typed in my number. You sure? I should warn you. I'm terrible at texting back promptly, and my idea of a fancy dinner is anywhere that doesn't have a drive-through window. I'll take my chances, she said, taking her phone back and flashing me a smile that made my heart do something stupid and acrobatic in my chest. 3 months later, we were dating exclusively. 6 months after that, I was pretty sure I was going to marry her. And 9 months into our relationship, she said, I want you to meet my father, with the kind of tone that suggested this was both inevitable and potentially disastrous. Meeting Conrad Rains for the first time was like a job interview where the interviewer has already decided you're unqualified, but is going through the motions for legal reasons. We met at his house in Coronado, a beautiful place with an ocean view that probably cost more than I'd make in 10 lifetimes, and he answered the door in khakis and a polo shirt that somehow still looked like a uniform. His handshake was a test, one of those grip-crushing displays of dominance that's supposed to intimidate you into submission. I matched his pressure, held eye contact, and didn't flinch. So you're the pilot, he said, not quite making it sound like a question. Lucas Vaughn, sir. Good to meet you. I replied, keeping my tone respectful but not subservient, because I learned a long time ago that men like Conrad respect confidence more than deference. Talia tells me you fly helicopters, he said, leading us into a living room that was decorated with naval memorabilia and family photos that all seemed to feature him receiving awards or shaking hands with important people. Yes, sir. 12 years active service, specialized in tactical extractions and combat support. He nodded, but I could see the dismissiveness in his eyes. National Guard. And there it was. The assumption. The casual downgrade. I felt Talia tense next to me, but I kept my expression neutral. No, sir. Active duty. Flew combat missions in 6 different theaters. Mostly the kind that don't make the news because they're classified. Interesting, he said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. And now, consulting, aviation safety, tactical operations planning, training programs for private sector helicopter services. Civilian work. He said it the way someone might say mall kiosk salesman or professional mime. Well, it's good you're staying employed. The dinner was painful. Conrad dominated the conversation, telling stories about his naval career that all somehow circled back to his accomplishments while making subtle digs about civilian life and how real service meant 30 years in uniform. Talia tried to steer the conversation to neutral topics, but her father had the conversational agility of a freight train on a single track. I smiled, nodded, answered questions when asked, and mentally calculated how many drinks I'd need after this to forget the experience. At one point, Talia's mother, Elizabeth, a kind woman who seemed perpetually exhausted by her husband's personality, asked me about my most memorable flight. I started to mention Operation Icevale, then stopped because I realized Conrad was in the room and the whole thing would get complicated fast. Instead, I told a sanitized version of a supply run gone wrong in Afghanistan, keeping it light and slightly funny. Conrad listened with half attention, checked his watch twice, and when I finished, said, supply runs. Important work, I suppose. Someone has to do the logistics. Talia's hand found mine under the table, squeezed hard. I squeezed back, a silent communication that meant, I'm fine, don't murder your father at dinner. When we left that night, Talia was furious in a way I'd never seen before. We sat in my car in her father's driveway, and she just started apologizing, rapid fire, words tumbling over each other. I'm so sorry. That was awful. He was so rude. I don't know why he's like this. You didn't deserve that. I should have warned you better. I stopped her by kissing her, which shut her up effectively and also seemed like a better use of our time than rehashing how her father thought I was basically a glorified taxi driver. When I pulled back, I said, hey, I've been shot at by people who actually wanted me dead. Your dad just doesn't know what to do with someone who married his daughter and didn't ask his permission first. I can handle it. You shouldn't have to handle it, she said quietly. Maybe not, but I'm handling it anyway because you're worth it. She looked at me with those eyes that made me want to promise her the world, then said, "I love you. You know that." "I do now," I replied, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in my life. A year later, we got married. The wedding was beautiful. Talia planned every detail with the precision of a military operation, which I found both hilarious and fitting given her family background. Her mother cried happy tears, her friends gave touching speeches, and Conrad gave a toast that was technically appropriate but loaded with enough subtext to sink a battleship. "To my daughter's husband," he said, raising his glass with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "May his landings be smoother than his career choices." The room laughed. Polite, uncomfortable laughter from people who weren't sure if this was affectionate ribbing or an actual insult. I knew which one it was. So did Talia, who looked like she wanted to throw her bouquet at her father's head. I stood up, raised my own glass, and looked Conrad dead in the eye. "And to my father-in-law, may his next promotion include humility." The laughter that followed was different. Surprised. Genuine. A few people actually applauded. Talia kicked me under the table, hard enough to leave a bruise I'd find later. But she was also trying not to smile. Conrad's expression flickered between shocked, annoyed, and something that might have been respect if you squinted hard enough. We didn't talk for the rest of the reception, but I'd made my point. I wasn't going to be the quiet son-in-law who took every dismissive comment with a smile. I was going to push back. Politely, but firmly. Looking back now, that was probably the moment Conrad decided I was either interesting or a problem. Maybe both. Either way, I'd stopped being invisible to him, which was progress. Even if he still didn't know I was the pilot who'd saved his brother's life. That revelation was coming. Just needed the right moment. In a briefing room full of witnesses. The thing about being retired from active duty is that you think you're done with the military, but the military is never quite done with you. It's like that ex who keeps showing up at parties you're trying to enjoy, standing in the corner, making eye contact across the room until you have to acknowledge them. Except instead of an awkward conversation about who kept the good coffee maker, it's official government correspondence with words like requested, advisory capacity, and your expertise would be valuable, which is bureaucratic speak for, we need you to show up, or we'll make your life administratively difficult. So when I got the letter, actual physical mail, because apparently the Navy still thinks it's 1985 and email is a passing fad, summoning me to Naval Base San Diego for a joint operations brief, my first reaction was to laugh. Then I read it again and realized they were serious. The letter was signed by some captain I'd never heard of, but the language was formal enough to suggest this wasn't optional. Your presence is requested as a civilian aviation consultant to observe and provide potential input on tactical helicopter operations. Translation: sit in a room, look interested, maybe answer a question if someone feels charitable enough to acknowledge you exist. I showed the letter to Talia over breakfast, sliding it across the kitchen table while she was scrolling through her phone and eating yogurt with the kind of focused intensity she brought to everything in her life. She picked it up, read it, and her expression shifted from curious to concerned to something that looked suspiciously like she was trying not to laugh. "They want you at Dad's briefing," she said, looking up at me with those eyes that could read a situation faster than most people could blink. Apparently, I took a sip of coffee, which had gone lukewarm while I'd been reading the letter for the 15th time. Think it's a coincidence? With my father? Nothing's a coincidence. Everything's a power move disguised as protocol. She set the letter down and leaned back in her chair. "You don't have to go, you know. You're retired. They can't actually make you do anything." "True," I said, considering it. "But if I don't show up, Conrad wins whatever game he's playing. And I'm petty enough that I'd rather sit through a boring briefing than give him the satisfaction of thinking I'm intimidated." She smiled at that, the kind of smile that suggested she knew exactly how petty I could be and found it endearing rather than concerning. "Just promise me you won't start anything." "Me? Start something?" I'm a model of restraint and professionalism. I said it with such conviction that even I almost believed it. "You told my father his next promotion should include humility at our wedding reception." That was different. That was justified sass. This is just sitting quietly in a room full of naval officers while they talk about things I probably already know. How much trouble could I possibly get into? Famous last words. Truly, if there's ever a documentary about my life, that clip will play right before the dramatic music starts, and everything goes sideways. The drive to San Diego took about 40 minutes through traffic that made me appreciate why people pay extra to live near their jobs. I'd been to the naval base before, consulting work, a few training sessions, the occasional meeting that could have been an email, but someone decided needed to be in person because military culture loves meetings the way toddlers love pudding. The base looked the same as always. Imposing gates, serious-faced guards who checked my ID like I might be a foreign spy disguised as a slightly tired civilian in khakis, and enough concrete and chain-link fence to make you forget that the ocean was literally right there being beautiful and free. I parked in the visitor lot, grabbed my laptop bag even though I knew I wouldn't need it. Old habits from years of service, and made my way to the administrative building where the briefing was being held. The air conditioning hit me like a blessing as soon as I walked inside, a stark contrast to the San Diego heat that was doing its best impression of the surface of the sun. A young petty officer at the front desk checked my name against a list, gave me a visitor badge that said civilian consultant in letters large enough to be read from space, and directed me to the third floor, Conference Room B. Conference Room B turned out to be one of those large briefing rooms with tiered seating, a massive screen at the front, and enough American flags to stock a 4th of July parade. I arrived about 10 minutes early. Punctuality was beaten into me during basic training and apparently never left, which meant the room was already half full with officers milling around, chatting in that pre-meeting way where everyone's pretending to be casual but is actually sizing each other up and calculating who's going to sit where based on rank and social dynamics. I grabbed a seat in the back row, the universal language for, "I'm here, but I'd rather not be," and pulled out my phone to check messages. Talia had texted, "Remember, you promised not to start anything." I sent back a thumbs-up emoji, which was non-committal enough to be technically honest while leaving myself room for interpretation later. The room continued to fill up. I recognized a few faces from my active duty days. Captain Reynolds, who'd put on some weight, but still had that drill sergeant energy. Commander Martinez, who I'd flown with on a training exercise once, and who'd spent the entire flight talking about his boat. A handful of lieutenants who all looked impossibly young and eager in a way that made me feel ancient despite being only 38. None of them recognized me, which was fine. I'd been out for 3 years, and unless you made an impression, good or bad, people moved on fast in the military. Then Admiral Conrad Rains walked in, and the room did that thing where everyone suddenly became 20% more alert and 40% more uncomfortable. He was wearing his service dress blues, ribbons and medals arranged with geometric precision, his posture so perfect it probably had its own training manual. He scanned the room with those sharp gray eyes that missed nothing, acknowledged a few senior officers with curt nods, and then his gaze landed on me. For a second, just a second, I saw surprise flicker across his face. Not huge, just a slight widening of the eyes, a microsecond pause in his usual commanding presence. He hadn't expected me to actually show up. Probably thought I'd ignore the summons like a civilian with no respect for military procedure. The surprise disappeared as fast as it appeared, replaced by his usual expression of controlled authority mixed with mild disapproval. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't nod, didn't even let his gaze linger. Just moved on to the podium at the front of the room like I was part of the furniture. Which, in his worldview, I probably was. The briefing started exactly on time because Conrad Rains didn't believe in being late or letting anyone else be late either. He launched into an overview of joint operations readiness, using enough military jargon to make a civilian translator weep. Charts appeared on the screen showing deployment statistics, helicopter availability rates, mission success percentages. It was all very professional, very thorough, and very boring. The kind of briefing where you could feel your soul trying to escape through your ears. I half listened, mostly focused on not falling asleep and embarrassing myself. Around me, officers took notes with the kind of earnest attention that suggested they either genuinely cared or were really good at faking it. Commander Martinez was definitely faking it. I could see him doodling what looked like a boat in the margins of his notepad. About 30 minutes in, Conrad moved on to a section about tactical helicopter operations in hostile environments. This was actually my area of expertise, the stuff I'd done for 12 years before hanging up my flight suit. He was talking about risk assessment, abort protocols, weather considerations, all the things that separate successful missions from smoking craters, and awkward phone calls to families. The key to successful extractions, Conrad said, his voice carrying that authoritative boom that made you want to stand up straighter even when sitting down, is knowing when to proceed and when to abort. A pilot who can't make that call has no business flying tactical missions. I felt my jaw tighten slightly. Because I knew, and he didn't know that I knew, that he'd overruled an abort call on Icevale. His own brother had been on that mission, and Conrad had decided that proceeding was more important than safety. Mason Rains had survived, but the mission had cost them. And 6 months later, Mason died on another operation under similar circumstances. An officer in the front row, young lieutenant, couldn't have been more than 25, raised his hand tentatively. Sir, what about situations where command overrules a pilot's abort recommendation? How do we balance operational necessity with safety? The room got quieter. It was a good question, the kind that made everyone uncomfortable because it implied that maybe the chain of command wasn't always right. Conrad's expression didn't change, but I saw his shoulders tense slightly. A commander makes decisions based on the bigger picture, he said carefully. Sometimes that means accepting calculated risks. A pilot's perspective is limited to their immediate situation. Command has to consider strategic objectives. It was a politician's answer. Technically correct, but fundamentally avoiding the actual question. The lieutenant nodded and sat back, apparently satisfied or at least smart enough not to push further. I almost said something. Almost. The words were right there, loaded and ready. What about when those calculated risks get people killed? But I didn't. Because I promised Talia I wouldn't start anything, and also because the timing wasn't right. If I was going to call out Conrad Rains, it needed to be when it would have maximum impact. The briefing continued. More charts, more statistics, more discussion about readiness levels and deployment rotations. Officers asked questions that were either genuinely curious or designed to make themselves look engaged for the Admiral's benefit. Conrad answered each one with practiced efficiency, the kind that came from decades of briefings just like this one. And then, about 45 minutes in, he did something I wasn't expecting. He paused, looked around the room with that expression that suggested he was about to say something he found amusing, and his eyes landed on me again. Before we move forward, he said, and I felt a cold sense of dread settle in my stomach because I knew. I just knew that whatever was coming next was going to be aimed directly at me. I think we should properly introduce our civilian observer. He gestured toward me with the kind of casual dismissiveness that was an art form. Gentlemen, this is Mr. Vaughn, my daughter's husband. He's here to observe and learn how actual naval operations are conducted. The room turned to look at me. 40 faces, most of them neutral, a few curious, one or two with barely concealed smirks because Conrad had just very publicly labeled me as the amateur in the room. The son-in-law who needed to be educated. The civilian who didn't understand real military work. I could have let it go. Could have just nodded politely and let the briefing continue. Could have been the bigger person. But where's the fun in that? I stood up slowly, making sure I had everyone's attention before I spoke. The room was silent, waiting to see how the civilian would respond to being called out by an admiral. Thank you for the introduction, sir, I said, keeping my voice respectful but not subservient. Though I should clarify, I'm not here to learn. I'm here because someone in your command thought my expertise in tactical helicopter operations might be valuable for this discussion. I paused, let that sink in. But I appreciate the warm welcome. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Conrad's expression hardened slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. I could see him recalculating, trying to figure out if I'd just challenged him or if I was being genuine. Before he could respond, I sat back down. Mission accomplished. The tension in the room was palpable. Commander Martinez had stopped doodling his boat. Captain Reynolds was staring at me with an expression somewhere between impressed and horrified. The young lieutenant who'd asked about abort protocols looked like he'd just witnessed something he wasn't sure he should have seen. Conrad cleared his throat, regaining control of the room. Well then, he said, his voice carrying an edge that could cut steel. Perhaps Mr. Vaughn can enlighten us with his civilian consulting perspective. It wasn't a request. It was a challenge. And I just walked right into it. This was it. The moment. I could back down, demur politely, say something safe and professional that wouldn't ruffle any feathers. Or I could commit to the chaos and see where it led. Spoiler, I committed to the chaos. Obviously. You know that feeling when you're standing on the edge of a diving board, looking down at water that's either going to be refreshing or painfully cold, and there's a crowd of people watching to see if you're actually going to jump? That was me, standing in that briefing room with 40 pairs of eyes locked on me, and Conrad Rains looking at me like I was a bug he was deciding whether to swat or ignore. The air conditioning seemed louder suddenly. Or maybe that was just my brain trying to find something to focus on besides the fact that I was about to either cement my reputation or destroy it in front of an audience that included some of the Navy's finest. I stayed standing because sitting felt like retreating, and I'd learned a long time ago that body language is half the battle when you're dealing with alpha personalities who measure dominance in posture and eye contact. Conrad was still at the podium, one hand resting casually on the edge like he owned not just the room, but the entire concept of authority. His expression was neutral, but I could see the challenge in his eyes, the same look a poker player gets when they're holding a decent hand and want to see if you'll fold. Well, he prompted, his voice carrying that edge of impatience that suggested my thinking time was over, and he was ready for me to either impress him or confirm all his worst assumptions about civilians. You mentioned expertise. Perhaps you'd like to share some insights on tactical helicopter operations? Specifically, how you'd handle a high-risk extraction in adverse weather conditions. Oh, he was good. He'd picked the exact scenario that he thought would expose me as an armchair consultant who talked big but had never actually done the work. The room was watching with the kind of attention people give to car accidents. Horrible to witness, but impossible to look away from. Commander Martinez had his pen poised over his notepad like he was about to take notes or draw a cartoon of my humiliation, unclear which. I could have given him a textbook answer. Could have spouted off some generic tactical principles that would have been technically correct, but boring enough to make everyone's eyes glaze over. Could have played it safe. Instead, I decided to tell a story. High-risk extraction in adverse weather. I repeated, nodding slowly like I was considering the question deeply. That's a good scenario. Hypothetically or based on actual experience. Either, Conrad said, and I caught the slight narrowing of his eyes that meant he was wondering where I was going with this. All right, then let me tell you about a real one, I said, shifting my weight slightly, getting comfortable because this was going to take a minute. February 2019, Arctic Circle, temperature -40 and dropping. 15-man SEAL team pinned down, surrounded, running out of ammunition and time. Weather conditions were what meteorologists were calling unsurvivable. Winds hitting 120 miles per hour, visibility 0, and a blizzard that was only getting worse. I saw a few officers sit up straighter. This wasn't textbook theory anymore. This was specific enough to be real, and people in military circles loved real stories, especially ones that sounded like they shouldn't have ended well. The base commander asked for volunteers to attempt extraction. I continued, watching Conrad's face carefully now because I could see recognition starting to dawn in his eyes. A slow-building realization that was absolutely beautiful to witness. Everyone said it was suicide. Every single person with flight experience said the smart move was to wait for the storm to pass, even though waiting meant those 15 men would likely freeze to death before conditions improved. The room was dead silent now. Even the air conditioning seemed to have gotten quieter, or maybe everyone was just holding their breath. Commander Martinez had stopped pretending to take notes, and was just staring at me with an expression that suggested he'd figured out where this was going and couldn't quite believe it. One pilot said yes. I went on, and I could see Conrad's knuckles going white where he gripped the podium because he knew. He absolutely knew what mission I was describing. Flew out with a co-pilot who prayed so hard during the flight that he probably annoyed God. Navigated through conditions that made instruments useless, where visibility was measured in good luck seeing your own hand in front of your face, and where every gust of wind tried to flip the helicopter like a pancake. I paused, let the silence stretch for a beat, 2 beats. Let them imagine it. Let them feel the weight of what I was describing. Found the team in a shallow ravine, loaded all 15 men in conditions that made landing impossible, so the pilot had to hover, which in a Category 5 Arctic storm is like trying to balance a pencil on its point during an earthquake while someone throws rocks at you. I smiled slightly, remembering Jenkins' face when we finally touched down back at base, the way his hands had been shaking so hard he couldn't unfasten his harness. Brought them all home. Not one casualty. The mission got classified, the pilot got a commendation, and the story became one of those legends that people whisper about, but nobody can quite confirm. The room erupted in whispers, officers leaning toward each other, talking in hushed, urgent tones. I heard fragments. Icevale, that was real? I thought that was exaggerated. No way that actually happened like that. Captain Reynolds was staring at me with his mouth slightly open, like I'd just performed a magic trick he couldn't figure out. Conrad's face had gone through several colors, red, white, now settling on a pale gray that suggested his blood pressure was doing interesting things. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. That's a nice story, he said, and his voice had lost some of its authority, replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like barely contained panic. But it doesn't answer my question about how you'd personally handle. I just did, I interrupted, and you could have heard a pin drop in that room. Interrupting an admiral was career suicide if you were active duty, but I was a civilian and technically couldn't be court-martialed for being rude. That was me. I was the pilot on Operation Icevale, the one who flew through the unsurvivable conditions, the one who brought your SEAL team home when everyone else said it couldn't be done. The whispers stopped. Just stopped, like someone had hit a mute button on the entire room. 40 officers, frozen in place, processing what I'd just said. Commander Martinez dropped his pen and it clattered onto the table, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. Conrad opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like he was trying to speak, but his brain had forgotten how language worked. A commander in the third row, Hill, I think his name was, Distinguished Service Cross on his uniform, gray hair that suggested he'd been around long enough to know the legends, spoke up in a voice that was equal parts awe and disbelief. Sir, you're saying you're the Reaper? The pilot from Icevale? I turned to look at him, nodded once. That's what they called me. Still do. Technically, though I don't use it much in civilian life because it tends to make people ask questions I can't always answer. But that's... Hill trailed off, looking between me and Conrad like he was watching a tennis match played with hand grenades. That's impossible. The Reaper is a legend. Half the people in this room think that mission is exaggerated or didn't happen the way the stories say it did. It happened exactly the way the stories say. I replied, keeping my voice level and factual. Probably worse, honestly. The stories don't usually mention that the co-pilot bit through his own lip from stress, or that we were flying on fumes by the time we made it back, or that I couldn't move my arms properly for 2 days afterward because of how hard I'd been fighting the controls. Another officer, younger lieutenant in the front row, raised his hand tentatively like he was in school and afraid of getting the answer wrong. What was your call sign? Your actual call sign. This was it. The moment. The perfect setup that I couldn't have planned better if I'd tried. I looked directly at Conrad, who was still gripping the podium like it was the only thing keeping him upright, and I smiled. The kind of smile that was friendly on the surface but carried the emotional equivalent of a tactical nuke underneath. Reaper Zero, I said clearly, letting each syllable land with weight and precision. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute vacuum of sound that happens when reality walks into a room and kicks everyone's assumptions in the teeth. 40 officers, every single one of them, just froze. Mouths open, pins suspended midair, coffee cups halfway to lips. It was like someone had hit pause on the entire world and forgotten to hit play again. Conrad's face went from pale gray to completely white, the kind of white you see on people who've just realized they've made a catastrophic mistake and there's no way to undo it. His mouth worked silently, trying to form words that wouldn't come. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated with what I can only describe as pure horror mixed with dawning comprehension. Because he knew. Oh, he knew exactly who Reaper Zero was. He'd signed a commendation letter himself. He'd read the mission reports, knew the details, knew that the pilot who'd saved his brother's life, and 14 other men, in those impossible conditions was considered one of the best tactical pilots in modern naval aviation history. And he'd just spent 3 years treating that pilot like furniture. Had called him Princess in front of 40 subordinates not 20 minutes ago. Had mocked his civilian career, dismissed his expertise, and generally acted like I was about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. The realization was spreading through the room like wildfire. I could see it on faces, the way eyes widened and jaws dropped as officers connected the dots between Reaper Zero and the guy the Admiral just insulted. Commander Hill looked like he might pass out. Captain Reynolds had gone completely still, his coffee cup frozen in midair like a statue. The young lieutenant who'd asked about abort protocols had his hand over his mouth, like he was physically trying to prevent himself from saying something that would get him in trouble. Someone's phone buzzed, a text message, probably, and the sound made at least 3 people actually jump. A folder fell off someone's lap and hit the floor with a slap that echoed through the silent room. Still, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They were all waiting to see what would happen next, like spectators at the world's most awkward sporting event. Conrad finally found his voice, though it came out rough and strained, like he was speaking through broken glass. That was you? Icevale was you? Yes, sir, I said, maintaining perfect military courtesy because now that I'd dropped the bomb, I could afford to be respectful. That was me. February 2019. You ordered the mission despite the abort recommendation from Weather Command. Your SEAL team needed extraction. I brought them home. All 15 of them, including Lieutenant Mason Rains. I saw Conrad flinch at his brother's name, a visible full-body flinch that made him take a half-step back from the podium. His knuckles were white, his jaw clenched so hard I thought he might shatter his own teeth. Mason was. He started, then stopped, then tried again. My brother was on that mission. I know, sir. He was second in command. Good man. Kept his team calm during extraction even though he was hypothermic and probably in shock. He shook my hand afterward, told me I'd saved all their lives. I paused, let that hang in the air. He died 6 months later. Different mission. I'm sorry for your loss. The room was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not shock, but something heavier. Grief, maybe. Recognition of sacrifice. The kind of moment that happens when you're reminded that behind all the ranks and protocols and military efficiency, there are actual human beings with families and histories and losses they carry. Conrad swayed slightly, like someone had physically pushed him. His eyes were unfocused, staring past me at something only he could see. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, and everyone had to strain to hear it. You saved my brother's life. Yes, sir. And 14 other men. It's what I was trained to do. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time maybe ever. Not as his daughter's civilian husband, not as the furniture in the corner, but as Major Lucas Vaughn, callsign Reaper Zero, the pilot who'd done the impossible and made it look routine. And I called you princess, he said, and it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of dawning horror that comes from realizing you've been a complete ass to someone who deserved your respect. I smiled again, that same small pleasant smile that I'd been wearing since this whole beautiful disaster started. Yes, sir. You did. About 20 minutes ago, in fact, right before you asked what my call sign was. The room made a collective sound, not quite a gasp, more like everyone simultaneously inhaling sharply and trying not to make it obvious. It was the auditory equivalent of watching a car crash in slow motion and being unable to look away. And in that moment, standing there with 40 witnesses who would tell this story for years to come, watching an admiral realize he'd just publicly humiliated a decorated pilot who'd saved his own brother's life, I had one crystal clear thought. This was absolutely, completely, worth every awkward family dinner I'd endured. If you've never watched a rumor spread through a military base in real time, let me tell you, it's faster than any internet connection and more efficient than any official communication channel ever invented. By the time lunch rolled around, approximately 3 hours after my little revelation in the briefing room, every single person on Naval Base San Diego had heard some version of the Admiral's son-in-law is actually Reaper Zero, and the Admiral called him princess in front of 40 officers. And it was the most beautiful disaster anyone has witnessed since Lieutenant Morrison accidentally saluted a statue thinking it was an admiral. I knew this because I couldn't walk 15 feet without someone staring at me like I was either a celebrity or a bomb about to detonate. Officers I'd never met nodded respectfully as I passed. Enlisted personnel whispered to each other and pointed, not subtly, just straight up pointed like I was an attraction at a zoo. One petty officer actually stopped me near the parking lot to ask if I'd sign his notebook, which was both flattering and deeply weird. Sorry, sir. My brother was on a deployment and he heard stories about Icevale. And if you're really the pilot, this would make his entire year, he said, looking embarrassed, but also hopeful in that way young service members have when they meet someone whose reputation precedes them. I signed his notebook because what else was I going to do? Refuse and look like a jerk? The kid was practically vibrating with excitement. I wrote, "Stay safe up there, Reaper Zero," and handed it back, and he looked at it like I'd just given him a winning lottery ticket. "Thank you, sir. This is incredible. Wait until I tell my squad." He practically sprinted away, clutching the notebook like it might evaporate if he didn't hold it tight enough. I made it to my car and sat there for a moment, just processing what the hell had just happened. My phone was blowing up with texts, mostly from Talia, who had apparently heard from 3 different sources what went down in the briefing room. Her messages were a mix of, "What did you do? Everyone is talking about this. My phone won't stop ringing, and Dad won't answer his phone, and his aide says he's unavailable. What does that mean?" I called her because texting felt insufficient for this level of chaos. She answered on the first ring. "Lucas Vaughn, what the actual hell happened?" "I may have introduced myself properly," I said, trying for casual and landing somewhere around guilty but not sorry. "Properly." Her voice went up an octave. "I've gotten calls from 4 different people, 4, telling me that you announced you were Reaper Zero in the middle of Dad's briefing and that he looked like he was going to pass out." "That's a fairly accurate summary, yes." There was a pause. A long pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone is trying to decide if they're angry or impressed, or some combination of both that doesn't have a name yet. "Did he really call you princess?" "Oh yeah, in front of 40 officers. Asked me what my call sign was. Very condescending tone, clearly expecting me to either not have one or to say something civilian and boring. So I told him." Another pause. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. Not a small laugh either. A full, genuine, almost crying laugh that went on for a solid 10 seconds. "Oh my God. Oh my God, Lucas. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Introduced myself. "You've humiliated a 3-star admiral in front of his entire staff." "He humiliated himself?" I corrected. I just provided context. She was still laughing, that kind of laughter that borders on hysteria. "My dad is never going to recover from this. This is going to follow him for the rest of his career. Do you know how many people have been waiting for something like this to happen? He's been so smug for so long. And now," she broke off into another fit of laughter. "Are you okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned now. "I'm great. This is the best thing that's happened in years. I love you so much right now." She was definitely crying with laughter at this point. I wish I could have seen his face. It was pretty spectacular, I admitted. He went through about 6 different colors. I'm pretty sure his blood pressure hit numbers that medical science didn't think were possible. "I can't believe you actually did it. I told you not to start anything." "I didn't start anything. Your dad asked me a direct question. I answered it. Very politely, I might add. I was a model of military courtesy throughout the entire exchange." "You're impossible," she said, but she was still laughing, so I figured I wasn't in too much trouble. "Okay, I have to go. I have 3 more calls coming in, and one of them is from Mom, which means this has reached peak family drama levels. Come home tonight and tell me everything. Every single detail. I want the full story with all the reactions." "Will do. Love you." "Love you too, you beautiful chaos agent." She hung up, and I sat there in my car, air conditioning blasting, watching naval personnel walk by and occasionally glance at my car like they knew who was inside. This was surreal. This was absolutely, completely surreal. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "Sir, this is Lieutenant Grace Moore, Admiral Rain's aide. The Admiral requests that you remain on base for the afternoon. He'd like to speak with you privately at 1500 hours. His office, Building 12, 3rd floor." I stared at the message. Requests. Sure. When an admiral requests something, what he means is do this or there will be consequences. I texted back, "I'll be there." The response came immediately. "Thank you, sir." I had 3 hours to kill, so I went to the base commissary and grabbed lunch. A surprisingly decent chicken sandwich and some chips that were definitely stale, but I ate them anyway, because stress eating is a valid coping mechanism. The commissary was packed with the lunch rush, and I swear at least a dozen people recognized me. The conversations would stop mid-sentence when I walked by, then resume in urgent whispers the moment I passed. At one table, I overheard 2 lieutenants talking. Heard he flew through a Category 5 storm. Impossible. The helicopter would have been torn apart. Saved 15 SEALs, including the Admiral's brother. And the Admiral didn't know? How did he not know? I kept walking, found a corner table, and ate my sandwich while pretending to read emails on my phone. In reality, I was trying not to think about the conversation I was about to have with Conrad in approximately 2 hours and 45 minutes. After lunch, I wandered around the base, killing time. Stopped by the aviation hangar because old habits die hard, and I can't resist looking at helicopters even when I'm not flying them anymore. The hangar was massive, housing about a dozen birds in various states of maintenance. The smell hit me immediately: jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, metal, and something else that's hard to describe but that every pilot knows instinctively. It's the smell of readiness, of potential, of machines that can kill you or save you depending on how you treat them. A crew chief was working on one of the birds, a young woman with her sleeves rolled up and grease on her hands. She glanced up when I approached, did a double take, and her eyes went wide. "You're him," she said, not a question. "I'm someone," I replied diplomatically. "Reaper Zero. Everyone's talking about it. You really flew Ice Veil." She stood up, wiping her hands on a rag that looked like it had never been clean in its entire existence. "I did." She looked at the helicopter she'd been working on, then back at me. "What's it like, flying in conditions like that?" "I mean, I've flown through some bad weather, but nothing like what the stories say about Ice Veil." I considered the question. Honestly, terrifying. Every instinct you have is screaming at you to turn around, to land, to do anything except keep flying forward. Your instruments are lying to you. Your body is lying to you, and the helicopter is fighting you every second. You're not flying so much as negotiating with physics and hoping it doesn't decide to kill you. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. "But you kept going. People were depending on me. That's the job. You don't get to quit just because it's hard." I looked at the bird she was maintaining, recognized it as one of the newer models. "You take good care of this one. Someone's life might depend on your work someday." "Yes, sir," she said, straightening up a little. "I will." I left the hangar feeling oddly emotional, like I'd just passed some kind of torch I didn't realize I was carrying. The military does that, makes you feel connected to people you've never met, part of something bigger than yourself even when you're technically not part of it anymore. At 1,445 hours, I made my way to Building 12. The receptionist on the third floor recognized me immediately, not surprising given that my face was probably the most discussed topic on base today, and directed me to wait in a small conference room adjacent to the Admiral's office. The room was sterile and professional, with a table, 6 chairs, and a painting of a naval battle that looked historically significant but that I couldn't identify. I sat down and waited. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second feeling like an hour. I wasn't nervous exactly, but I was definitely feeling something. Anticipation, maybe, or the kind of tension that comes before a conversation you know is going to be significant. At exactly 1,500 hours, the door opened and Admiral Conrad Rains walked in. He looked older than he had this morning. Not physically older, but worn down, like someone had taken sandpaper to his usual confidence and authority. His uniform was still perfect, his posture still military straight, but something in his eyes was different. Vulnerable, maybe. Human. He closed the door behind him, stood there for a moment like he was gathering his thoughts, and then said, "I owe you an apology." I hadn't been expecting that. Not even a little bit. I'd been prepared for anger, for defensiveness, for him to try to spin the situation into something that wasn't entirely his fault. But an apology? From Conrad Rains? That was like seeing a unicorn do taxes, theoretically possible, but practically unheard of. "Sir," I started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. Please." He pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. And for the first time since I'd met him, he looked directly at me like he was seeing me instead of looking through me. "I called you princess. I dismissed your expertise. I've spent 3 years treating you like you were an inconvenience rather than a person, let alone the person who saved my brother's life. And I did all of that because I was too arrogant and too stubborn to see past my own biases about civilian life and what it means to serve. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Just listened. Mason talked about you," Conrad continued, his voice getting quieter. "After Ice Veil, he said the pilot who extracted them was the bravest person he'd ever met. Said anyone who could fly through those conditions and bring everyone home was someone special. He never told me your name. Classified mission, couldn't share details. But he said if he ever met you again, He'd buy you every drink in whatever bar you were in. My throat tightened. I'd known Mason Rains for exactly 4 hours, the flight back from Ice Vale and the brief time afterward. But in that time, he'd been professional, grateful, and kind. Learning that he'd talked about me, that he'd thought of me after, hit harder than I expected. He was a good man, I said quietly. He was. And I got him killed 6 months later by making the same mistake I made with Ice Vale, ordering a mission to proceed when it should have been aborted. Conrad's eyes were shining now, not quite tears but close. I've been carrying that guilt for 5 years. And then you walked into my daughter's life. And instead of seeing you, I saw a reminder of everything I've done wrong. So I pushed you away, dismissed you, made you into something small so I wouldn't have to confront how big my failures were. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, someone was shouting drill commands. I don't know if you can forgive me, Conrad said. I don't know if I deserve it. But I want you to know that I see you now. Major Lucas Vaughn, Reaper Zero, the man who saved my brother and 14 other men, and the man my daughter chose to marry, which means she saw something in you that I was too blind to see. I took a breath, let it out slowly. Sir, I'm not going to pretend the last 3 years haven't been frustrating. They have been. But I also understand that grief makes people do things that don't make sense. You lost your brother. That's not something you just get over. No, he agreed. But it's also not an excuse to treat people badly. No, it's not, I said, because honesty seemed important here. But it's a reason, and reasons matter. He nodded, seemed to consider that. Can we start over? Not forget the past, but maybe build something better going forward. I thought about it. Thought about Talia, about family dinners, about the possibility of not feeling like an outsider every time I walked into a room with Conrad Rains in it. Yeah, I said finally. We can do that. He extended his hand across the table. I took it. His grip was firm, respectful, nothing like the dominance-testing handshake from our first meeting. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, sir. We sat there for another minute, neither of us quite ready to leave, both of us processing what had just happened. Finally, Conrad stood up, straightened his uniform in that automatic way military people do, and gave me a small smile. For what it's worth, Princess might be the worst call sign guess in naval history. I laughed, surprised. Yeah, it really was. Reaper Zero, though? That's one hell of a name. Earned it the hard way. The best ones always are. He left, and I sat there alone in the conference room, feeling like something significant had shifted. Not fixed. You don't fix 3 years of tension in one conversation, but shifted. Like maybe, possibly, there was a path forward that didn't involve constant low-level warfare at family dinners. My phone buzzed. Talia, well? Did he kill you? Are you alive? Should I start planning a funeral? I texted back, still alive. Actually had a good conversation. Tell you about it tonight. Her response was immediate. A good conversation? With my father? Are you sure you're talking to the right person? Pretty sure. He apologized and everything. I don't believe you. This is a prank. You're pranking me. Not a prank. Real life. Apparently, I broke something loose. You broke my father loose. I don't know whether to be impressed or terrified. Go with impressed. I'm going with impressed. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in years. The San Diego sun setting behind me in shades of orange and pink that looked almost unreal. The base gates receded in my rearview mirror, and with them, some weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Turned out, sometimes the best thing you can do is tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may. Even if those chips are an admiral's ego. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ice Vale than what I remembered, more to Mason's death than bad luck and timing. So I did something probably illegal. I accessed the classified mission archives using credentials that technically hadn't expired yet, even though I definitely shouldn't have been using them anymore. The file room was digital now, thankfully, because breaking into an actual physical archive would have required skills I didn't have and a willingness to commit felonies I wasn't quite ready for. I logged in, pulled up Operation Ice Vale, and started reading through reports I'd never seen before, command logs, weather data, communication transcripts. And there it was, buried in a communication log timestamped 20 minutes before we launched. Pilot Vaughn requests mission abort due to unsurvivable weather conditions. Request denied by Commander Rains. Proceed with extraction as ordered. Conrad had overruled my abort call. I'd forgotten that detail, buried it under the adrenaline and chaos of the actual mission. But there it was, in official records, proof that I tried to stop the mission and he'd forced it forward anyway. 3 weeks later, we both got summoned to a review board. Someone had noticed my file access. Of course they had. And now the Navy wanted answers. The hearing room was cold, filled with senior officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, reviewing anything else besides a 5-year-old mission that was supposed to stay buried. They asked me directly, "What did you find in those files, Major Vaughn?" I could have lied. Could have said I was just reminiscing. Instead, I told the truth. Radar data was altered post-mission. My abort request was denied and then scrubbed from preliminary reports. 2 men died on subsequent missions using the same flawed decision-making process, one by storm, one by ego. The room went silent. Then Conrad stood up, looking 10 years older than he had 3 weeks ago. "He's right," Conrad said, voice steady despite everything. "I overruled that abort call. My brother Mason survived Icevale, but I got him killed 6 months later, making the same mistake. I thought leadership meant never backing down. I was wrong." I looked at him, then at the board. "Don't strip his rank. Make him teach what he learned. Let him show others what arrogance costs before it costs them everything." They agreed. Progress over punishment. For once, the Navy chose growth. A year later, I attended a training program graduation at the same base where everything started. The banner read, "Leadership Under Fire, Learning from Failure." Conrad stood at the podium, grayer but somehow lighter, and addressed a room full of young officers. "I once mocked a man who taught me the hardest lesson of my career," he said. His call sign was Reaper Zero. His lesson, real command starts when you admit you're wrong. The applause was genuine. Real. I actually clapped this time, no pettiness required. Afterward, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a note from Mason, written after Icevale. "To the pilot who brought me home, tell my brother I saw heaven once. It was made of ice and rotor blades. Thank him for sending you. He forgave you first," I said quietly. Conrad nodded, tears in his eyes. "And you?" "Already did. Just wanted to see you work for it a little." We both laughed. Awkward, real, human. Later, the Navy unveiled a new helicopter model, RZ-01, named after me. When they asked for a speech, I simply said, "You called me Princess. Now your fleet's named after me." I'd call that character development. The crowd roared. Above us, the Reaper gleamed gold in the sunset. Finally, the sky felt like home. I came home early from work to surprise my wife. Instead, I found clothes leading up the stairs to our bedroom. I sat in my recliner with my gun, waiting for them to finish. You know how they say life can change in a heartbeat? Well, that's a load of crap. Life doesn't change in a heartbeat. It shatters in the time it takes to turn a doorknob. And let me tell you, I should have seen it coming. Hell, maybe I did see it coming and just chose to ignore all the red flags waving in my face like I was some kind of damn matador. That Friday afternoon started out perfect. I'm talking magazine cover perfect. I'd wrapped up the Henderson case early, got that poor bastard off on a technicality that would have made Perry Mason proud, and I was feeling like I could conquer the world. The sun was shining through my corner office windows, casting those golden rays that make you feel like you're living in some Hollywood movie. I had my weekend all mapped out, every detail planned to perfection. Santorini. 2 first-class tickets tucked safely in my briefcase. The honeymoon suite at that boutique hotel overlooking the Aegean Sea that Talia had bookmarked on her laptop about 100 times. And the necklace. Jesus Christ, that necklace. 3 months' salary sitting in a velvet box in my jacket pocket. This delicate white gold chain with a diamond pendant that caught the light like trapped starfire. She'd stood in front of that jewelry store window for 20 minutes last month, her breath fogging up the glass as she pressed her nose against it like some kid at a candy shop. "It's beautiful," she'd whispered, and I'd made a mental note right then and there. Our 5th anniversary deserved something special. She deserved something special. Or so I thought. I left the office at 2:30, which was practically unheard of for me. My secretary, Mrs. Chun, actually looked concerned when I told her to reschedule my Monday appointments. "Everything all right, Mr. Briggs?" she asked, peering at me over those reading glasses that made her look like a concerned librarian. I just grinned and told her I was surprising my wife. The word wife tasted sweet in my mouth back then. Funny how quickly that can change. The drive home through downtown Chicago was smooth sailing. Traffic was light for a Friday, and I had the radio cranked up, singing along to some classic rock station like I didn't have a care in the world. I even stopped at that fancy wine shop on Michigan Avenue and picked up a bottle of that expensive French champagne Talia loved, the one that cost more than most people's car payments. Money wasn't an object when it came to her happiness. It never had been. Our brownstone looked perfect as I pulled into the driveway. The lawn was immaculate. I'd paid good money for that landscaping service, and the autumn flowers Talia had planted were still blooming in the window boxes. Everything looked exactly like it should in our picture-perfect life. I remember thinking about how lucky I was as I walked up those front steps, keys jingling in my hand, already imagining the look on her face when I surprised her with the trip. That's when my perfect world went straight to hell. The front door wasn't locked. That should have been my first clue, but I was too caught up in my romantic fantasy to pay attention. Talia always locked the door. Always. It was practically a religion with her after that break-in scare we'd had 2 years ago. But there I was, turning the handle and stepping into our foyer like some clueless schmuck in a bad movie. The shoes hit me first. Men's dress shoes. Size 11, maybe 12. Italian leather, expensive looking. Not mine. Definitely not mine. They were just sitting there by the door like they belonged, like some other man had every right to make himself comfortable in my house. My heart started doing this weird stuttering thing, but I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was Jerome, my law partner. Maybe he'd stopped by to discuss a case. But Jerome wore sneakers. Always sneakers. Then I saw the shirt. Navy blue, buttoned down, hanging off the banister like some kind of sick breadcrumb trail. My mouth went dry as dust. Next came a bra. Black lace. One I'd bought for Talia last Valentine's Day. It was draped over the bottom step like it had been tossed there in a hurry, and seeing it there, in that context, made my stomach twist into knots. The jeans were next. Women's jeans. Talia's jeans. The ones that hugged her curves just right, the ones I loved seeing her in. They were crumpled on the fourth step, and that's when the reality of what I was looking at finally sank in. This wasn't some innocent explanation. This was a trail. A goddamn trail leading upstairs to my bedroom. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, staring up those stairs like they led to the gates of hell. Part of me wanted to charge up there, burst through the bedroom door, and confront whatever nightmare was waiting for me. But another part, the lawyer part, the strategic part, told me to slow down, to think, to be smart about this. So I walked into the den, my legs feeling like they were made of lead, and I grabbed my old leather recliner. That chair had been my grandfather's, passed down through 3 generations of Briggs men. It was heavy as hell, but adrenaline is a powerful thing. I dragged it across the hardwood floor, the legs scraping and squealing like nails on a chalkboard, and positioned it right at the bottom of the staircase. Then I went to the safe. My hands were surprisingly steady as I spun the combination, Talia's birthday, because I was that kind of fool, and pulled out my .45. The gun felt cold and familiar in my hands. I'd had it for years, ever since that case where I'd gotten death threats from some gangbangers' crew. I kept it clean, kept it loaded, kept it ready. Just in case. Well, this was definitely a just-in-case moment. I settled into that old recliner, the leather creaking under my weight, and stared up at the ceiling. I could hear them now. Voices. Laughter. The sound of my marriage dying one giggle at a time. The gun sat heavy in my lap, and I wasn't sure what I was planning to do with it. I wasn't a violent man by nature. I was a lawyer, for Christ's sake. I solved problems with words, not bullets. But sitting there in that chair, listening to my wife destroying everything we'd built together, I felt something cold and calculating settle over me like a blanket. I needed to know. I needed to see. I needed to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went. So I waited, patient as a spider in its web, ready for whatever came down those stairs. You'd think a man finding out his wife is cheating would lose his mind, right? Start screaming, throwing things, maybe punch a hole in the wall like some kind of suburban Incredible Hulk. But here's the thing about betrayal. Real betrayal, the kind that cuts you down to the bone. It doesn't make you crazy. It makes you cold. Ice cold. And sitting in that recliner, listening to the sounds of my marriage being flushed down the toilet upstairs, I felt something settle over me that was scarier than rage. I felt calm. Dead calm. The kind of calm that comes right before a hurricane hits, when the air gets thick and everything goes still. That's exactly what was happening inside my head. All the noise, all the emotion, all the hurt, it just went quiet. Like someone had hit the mute button on my soul. I shifted my weight in the chair, the old leather groaning beneath me. And that's when I noticed the coffee table. Our beautiful glass coffee table that Talia had spent 3 weeks picking out, the one that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And sitting on top of it, like they owned the damn place, were his things. A brown leather wallet. Expensive looking, the kind that screams, "I've got money and I want everyone to know it." And next to it, a cell phone in one of those fancy cases that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries. This son of a bitch had been here before. That hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing, some, oops, we got carried away bullshit that Talia might try to sell me later. No, this bastard was comfortable enough in my house to just toss his personal belongings around like he lived here. Like he belonged here. Like he had every right to make himself at home while he screwed my wife in the bed I paid for. The phone was face up, and I could see notifications lighting up the screen every few minutes. Text messages, missed calls, the usual digital noise that follows us around like electronic shadows these days. But one name kept popping up over and over again. Home. Someone was trying to reach this piece of garbage, and they were getting pretty damn insistent about it. I reached over and picked up the phone, surprised by how steady my hands were. You'd think they'd be shaking, right? But they weren't. They were rock solid, like I was performing surgery or defusing a bomb. The screen was locked, but iPhones show you just enough to be dangerous. I could see partial messages, timestamps, missed call notifications. And that contact name, Home, it was listed as the primary emergency contact. His wife. This bastard had a wife. That realization hit me like a freight train loaded with irony. Here I was, sitting in my house with a gun in my lap, waiting to confront my cheating wife and her lover, and it turns out the other man was married too. Some poor woman out there was probably wondering why her husband wasn't answering his phone, maybe getting dinner ready, maybe helping kids with homework, completely clueless that her world was about to implode just like mine. I stared at that phone for what felt like forever, watching it light up with another missed call from home. The preview showed part of a text message. "Where are you? Kids are asking." And that was all I could see. But it was enough. More than enough. Before I could second-guess myself, I swiped to answer the next call that came in. The phone barely rang once before a woman's voice came through, sharp and irritated. "Reed, where the hell have you been? I've been calling you for 2 hours." Reed. So that was his name. Reed. It sounded like the kind of name that belonged to some preppy asshole from the country club, the type who wore boat shoes without socks and thought he was God's gift to womankind. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. Years of courtroom experience had taught me how to stay calm under pressure. "This isn't Reed." There was a pause. A long, loaded pause that stretched between us like a tightrope. "Who is this?" Her voice had changed. Gone was the irritation, replaced by something sharper. Suspicion. Fear, maybe. "My name is Malcolm Briggs," I said, each word deliberate and clear. "And I'm sitting in my living room, holding your husband's phone." Another pause. I could hear her breathing, could practically feel her mind racing, trying to process what I'd just told her. "Where's Reed?" she asked, and her voice had gotten smaller. Quieter. Like she already knew the answer, but needed to hear it anyway. "Upstairs," I said. "In my bedroom. With my wife." The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched on for so long I thought she might have hung up. But then I heard something that surprised me. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She didn't start screaming or demanding explanations. Instead, she laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with recognition. "Son of a bitch," she whispered, and I could hear years of suspicion and doubt crystallizing into certainty in those 3 words. "Ma'am, I'm sorry you had to find out this way," I said, and I meant it. Whatever Reed had done to his marriage, however many lies he'd told this woman, she didn't deserve to discover the truth from a stranger holding her husband's phone. "Dana," she said. "My name is Dana. And don't apologize. I've been waiting for this call for 3 years. 3 years. Jesus Christ. How long had Reed been pulling this shit? How many other wives were there? How many other families had this bastard torn apart with his wandering dick and his expensive Italian shoes? What are you going to do?" Dana asked, and there was something in her voice that made me sit up straighter. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pleading. It was something else entirely. I haven't decided yet, I said, which was the truth. The gun was still in my lap, cold and heavy and full of possibilities I wasn't ready to explore. Well, when you figure it out, Dana said, her voice getting harder with each word. You tell that worthless piece of shit not to bother coming home. Tell him I'll be waiting with divorce papers and a restraining order. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the sound of my own breathing and the muffled voices still drifting down from upstairs. I set the phone back on the coffee table, right where I'd found it, and settled back into my chair. Reed's wife, ex-wife, apparently, had just given me something I hadn't expected. Permission. Not that I needed anyone's permission to handle my own business, but knowing that Dana was on my side, that she was ready to burn Reed's world down just as completely as he'd burned mine, well, that changed things. That made this whole situation a lot more interesting. There's something almost theatrical about the moment your life falls apart. Like you're watching it happen from the balcony seats while some other poor bastard plays your role down on stage. That's exactly how I felt sitting in that recliner, the .45 heavy in my hands, waiting for the final act of my marriage to come stumbling down those stairs. The sounds from upstairs had gotten louder over the past few minutes. Not just voices anymore, but movement. Footsteps. The creak of floorboards that I knew by heart. The loose one near the dresser. The squeaky spot by the bathroom door. These were the intimate sounds of my own house being violated, and each one felt like a needle sliding under my skin. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Laughter. Giggles, actually. High-pitched, breathless giggles that I recognized immediately as Talia's. The same laugh she used to make when I'd surprise her with flowers or tell her a stupid joke. The same laugh that used to make my chest tighten with love was now making my finger tighten on the trigger. But I wasn't some hothead. I wasn't going to go off half-cocked like some character in a bad action movie. I was Malcolm Briggs, criminal defense attorney, master of self-control and calculated decisions. So I did what any rational man would do in this situation. I clicked off the safety with a sound that seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot itself. The metallic click was crisp and final, the kind of sound that changes everything. It's funny how such a small noise can carry so much weight, so much promise of violence. I'd heard that sound 1,000 times at the shooting range, but sitting in my living room with my marriage dissolving above my head, it sounded different. Heavier. More real. The footsteps upstairs stopped for just a second. Complete silence. Even the house itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. It was the kind of silence that comes right before an earthquake, when all the animals go quiet and the air gets thick with electricity. I could feel it pressing against my eardrums like I was underwater. Then the floorboards creaked again, and I heard them coming down the stairs. Talia appeared first, and Jesus Christ, she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who'd just been thoroughly screwed by someone who wasn't her husband. Her dark hair was tousled in that way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with passion. She was wearing that silk robe I bought her for Christmas, the emerald green one that brought out her eyes. It was hanging open just enough to be scandalous, and her skin had that flushed glow that I used to love seeing on lazy Sunday mornings. But when her eyes met mine, when she saw me sitting there in that chair with the gun across my lap, everything about her changed. The satisfied smile vanished. The lazy, post-sex contentment evaporated like steam. Her green eyes went wide with something that was part shock, part fear, and part guilt so thick you could cut it with a knife. Malcolm, she whispered, and my name coming out of her mouth sounded like a prayer or a curse. Maybe both. Her hand went to her throat, fingers finding the pulse point there like she was checking to make sure her heart was still beating. That's when Reed stumbled into view behind her, and I got my first good look at the son of a bitch who'd been screwing my wife. He was exactly what I'd expected, mid-30s, probably worked out religiously, the kind of guy who thought his abs gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. His chest was bare, revealing one of those carefully sculpted physiques that screamed, I spend more time at the gym than I do with my family. His dark hair was messed up in that same telling way as Talia's, and he had that smug, satisfied expression that some men get after they think they've conquered something. At least, he had that expression until he saw the gun. I watched the color drain from his face like someone had pulled a plug. It was actually kind of fascinating from a psychological standpoint. The way his arrogant smirk melted into confusion, then understanding, then pure, undiluted terror. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and I could practically see his brain trying to process the situation he'd just walked into. "Malcolm, wait." Talia's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a scream. She took a step toward me, one hand extended like she was approaching a wild animal. Which, come to think of it, wasn't that far from the truth. I didn't say anything, didn't move. Just sat there staring at them both, taking in every detail of this moment that would be burned into my memory forever. The way Talia's robe had slipped off one shoulder. The way Reed's hands were trembling at his sides. The way they both looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world than standing on my staircase, caught red-handed in the act of destroying my life. Reed finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. "Look, man, I can explain." But he never got the chance to finish that sentence. Because that's when something inside me snapped. Not into rage. I was still ice cold, still in complete control. But something deeper than anger, something that had been building since I first saw those Italian leather shoes by my front door. Reed must have seen it in my eyes, because he suddenly spun around like he was going to run back up the stairs. Like he could somehow escape this situation by retreating to the scene of the crime. The coward actually thought he could run away from what he'd done. That's when I pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space of my foyer. The .45 kicked back against my palm with familiar authority, and the bullet tore into the wooden banister about 6 inches from Reed's head. Splinters exploded in every direction, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air like incense in a very different kind of church. Both Talia and Reed screamed. High, piercing sounds that probably woke up half the neighborhood. Reed dove forward, hitting the stairs hard enough to bruise, while Talia pressed herself against the wall like she was trying to meld into it. The echo of the gunshot seemed to go on forever, bouncing off the walls and ceiling before finally fading into a silence that was somehow even more profound than before. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady as a metronome. I could hear Talia's ragged breathing. I could hear Reed whimpering like a kicked dog. "That," I said, my voice perfectly calm and conversational, "was your warning shot." The aftermath of a gunshot is something you can't really prepare for, even when you're the one pulling the trigger. The silence that follows is different from regular silence. It's got weight to it, substance, like the air itself has been traumatized. And in that loaded quiet, with the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air like a threat, I watched two people I thought I knew transform into something else entirely. Reed was pressed against the stairs like he was trying to become part of the wood, his chest heaving like he'd just run a marathon. Sweat was pouring down his face, mixing with what might have been tears, though I doubted this particular specimen was capable of genuine emotion. His perfectly sculpted abs were contracting with each panicked breath, and I found myself thinking that all those hours in the gym hadn't prepared him for this kind of workout. Talia was frozen against the wall, her silk robe clutched closed with white-knuckled fists. Her green eyes, the same eyes I'd stared into on our wedding day while promising to love and cherish her till death do us part, were wide with terror. But underneath that fear, I could see something else. Calculation. She was already trying to figure out how to spin this, how to minimize the damage, how to make this somehow not her fault. That's when I realized I was looking at strangers. These weren't the people I thought I'd been living with, loving, building a life alongside. These were actors who'd been playing roles, and I'd been too blind or too trusting or too goddamn stupid to see through their performance. "Nobody moves," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Nobody speaks unless I ask them a direct question. And nobody, and I mean nobody, tries to leave this house until I get some answers." They both nodded frantically, looking like bobblehead dolls in the back window of some teenager's car. Good. Fear was useful. Fear made people honest, and honesty was exactly what I needed right now. I shifted in the recliner, the leather creaking beneath me, and kept the gun trained in their general direction, not pointing directly at either of them. I wasn't completely unhinged, but close enough that they knew I meant business. "How long?" I asked, looking directly at Talia. As she opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again like she was practicing some kind of verbal gymnastics routine. When she finally found her voice, it came out as barely a whisper. "Malcolm, I can explain." I didn't ask for an explanation. I cut her off. I asked how long. How long have you been screwing this piece of shit in our bed? The words hung in the air between us like a physical thing, ugly and sharp-edged. Talia flinched like I'd slapped her, which was interesting because apparently being called out on her adultery hurt worse than actually committing it. 6 months, she whispered, and those 2 words hit me harder than the gunshot had hit that banister. 6 months. Half a year. That meant this had been going on during my birthday, during our trip to Napa Valley, during all those nights when she claimed she was working late or out with girlfriends or at book club. 6 months of lies, 6 months of deception, 6 months of me being the biggest sucker in Chicago. Every business trip? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded, tears starting to stream down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of someone who'd gotten caught. Someone who was sorry about the consequences, but not about the actions that led to them. Where? Hotels, mostly. Reed spoke up for the first time since the gunshot, his voice shaky, but trying to sound reasonable. Like we were discussing the weather instead of the systematic destruction of my marriage. Sometimes my place when Dana was. I wasn't talking to you, I said, swinging the gun in his direction just enough to shut him up. In fact, the only time I want to hear your voice is if you're bleeding out and need to confess your sins before you meet your maker. Reed's mouth snapped shut so fast I heard his teeth click together. I turned back to Talia, studying her face like I was seeing it for the first time. And in a way I was. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved for 7 years, was a stranger wearing a familiar mask. Did you use protection? I asked, and I watched her face cycle through confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been shame. What? It's not a complicated question, Talia. When you were fucking this married piece of garbage, did you at least have the courtesy to use protection, or were you trying to give me some kind of parting gift? Her face went pale, then flushed red, then pale again. I was on the pill, she said quietly. I laughed. Actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the alternative was putting a bullet through the wall, and I was trying to be civilized about this whole situation. Oh, how thoughtful, I said, letting the sarcasm drip from every word. So considerate. You were planning to keep screwing around indefinitely, but at least you didn't want to complicate things with an inconvenient pregnancy. Very practical. Very modern. Malcolm, please. Please what? Please forgive you? Please pretend this never happened? Please pack up and leave so you 2 lovebirds can continue your affair without the messy complications of a husband getting in the way. She was sobbing now, ugly crying that made her mascara run down her cheeks in black streaks. But I felt nothing. No sympathy, no urge to comfort her, no desire to make her feel better. If anything, I felt disgusted that I'd ever been attracted to someone so weak, so selfish, so fundamentally dishonest. I looked at Reed, who was still trying to make himself invisible against the staircase. How many others? I asked. He looked confused, like the question was somehow unexpected. What? How many other wives have you screwed? How many other marriages have you destroyed? Because a guy like you doesn't just wake up one day and decide to start cheating. This is a pattern, a lifestyle. So I want to know exactly how much of a piece of shit I'm dealing with. Reed's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like he was trying to do complex math in his head, which was probably exactly what he was doing. Can't remember? I asked conversationally. That many, huh? Well, that's interesting. Very interesting indeed. I turned back to Talia, who was watching this exchange with growing horror, like she was finally understanding what kind of man she'd thrown her marriage away for. One more question, I said to her. Were you trying to get pregnant? The question hit her like a physical blow. She actually staggered backward, pressing herself harder against the wall. What? No. I told you, I was on the pill. That's not what I asked. I asked if you were trying to get pregnant. Were you hoping to get knocked up by Mr. Wonderful here, so you could divorce me and take half my money while claiming you needed child support for his bastard? Malcolm, that's horrible. I would never. You would never what? Cheat on your husband? Lie to his face for 6 months? Bring your lover into our home, into our bed? Because you've already done all of those things, sweetheart. So forgive me if I don't take your word for what you would or wouldn't do. The fight went out of her then. I could actually see it happen, like someone had unplugged her batteries. Her shoulders sagged, her head dropped, and she slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, looking like a broken doll in an expensive silk robe. I still love you, she whispered, and those 4 words made me angrier than anything else she could have said. That's when I laughed again. Really laughed this time. Deep belly laughs that echoed off the walls and seemed to go on forever. I laughed until my sides hurt, until tears streamed down my cheeks, until both Talia and Reed were staring at me like I'd completely lost my mind. Maybe I had. You love me, I said when I could finally speak again. That's rich. That's absolutely fucking rich. You love me so much that you've been screwing another man for 6 months. You love me so much that you brought him into our home, into our bed, on the day I was planning to surprise you with a trip to Santorini for our anniversary. You love me so much that you're willing to destroy everything we've built together for some cheap thrills with a serial cheater who can't even remember how many marriages he's wrecked. I stood up then, still holding the gun, and looked down at both of them like they were something I'd scraped off my shoe. You know what, Talia? I don't think you understand what love actually means. Because love, real love, doesn't do this. Real love doesn't betray. Real love doesn't lie. Real love doesn't turn your whole life into a fucking joke. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built my entire adult life around, looked up at me from the floor with mascara-streaked cheeks and said nothing at all. Because there was nothing left to say. The truth was out now, hanging in the air between us like poison gas. And the taste of it was more bitter than I'd ever imagined. There's a moment in every man's life when he realizes that words aren't enough anymore. When all the talking, all the reasoning, all the civilized conversation in the world won't fix what's broken or make people understand the gravity of what they've done. I'd reached that moment about 30 seconds ago, and the cold clarity that came with it was almost beautiful in its simplicity. I picked up Reed's phone from the coffee table, the screen still lighting up with notifications from his increasingly frantic wife. Well, soon-to-be ex-wife, if Dana was as good as her word. The device felt heavier than it should have, weighted down with all the lies and betrayals it had facilitated over the past 6 months. Take it, I said, holding the phone out toward Reed. He stared at me like I'd just offered him a live grenade, which, in a way, I had. Take the goddamn phone, Reed. His hand shook as he reached for it, his fingers trembling so badly he nearly dropped it when our skin made contact. The touch made my skin crawl. The idea that this man's hands had been all over my wife, that his body had been pressed against hers, that he'd been inside her in ways that were supposed to be mine alone. The thought made my trigger finger itch. Call your wife, I said, my voice steady as granite. Tell her where you are. Tell her what you've been doing. Tell her exactly what kind of man she married. Reed's face went even paler, if that was possible. He looked like a ghost wearing expensive cologne and too much hair gel. Look, man, I don't give a shit what you think. I cut him off. I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm not requesting your cooperation. I'm telling you what's going to happen. You're going to call Dana, and you're going to tell her the truth. All of it. She already knows, he stammered. You already told her. She knows you're here. She knows you're screwing my wife. But she doesn't know the details, does she? She doesn't know that you've been doing this for 6 months. She doesn't know that this isn't the first marriage you've helped destroy. She doesn't know that you're the kind of man who throws his wallet and phone around another man's house like you own the place. Reed's eyes darted toward the front door like he was calculating his chances of making a run for it. I could practically see the wheels turning in his head, weighing his options, trying to figure out if he was fast enough to reach the door before I could put a bullet in his back. Don't even think about it, I said conversationally. I was second in my class at the police academy shooting range before I decided law school was a better career path. I can put 3 rounds center mass before you take 2 steps. That killed whatever escape plan was forming in his pea-brain. His shoulders sagged in defeat, and he looked down at the phone in his hands like it was his own death warrant. Please, he whispered. My kids. Your kids. I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Yeah, let's talk about your kids. How old are they, Reed? He swallowed hard. 8 and 10. 8 and 10. So they're old enough to understand when Daddy doesn't come home anymore. Old enough to hear the neighbors whispering about what Daddy did to break up the family. Old enough to be ashamed of their last name when this whole mess becomes public record. I watched him process that. Watched the reality of his situation sink in like water into sand. The affair hadn't just been about sex or excitement, or whatever pathetic midlife crisis had driven him to my wife's bed. It had consequences. Real consequences that would ripple through multiple families for years to come. You should have thought about your kids before you decided to stick your dick where it doesn't belong, I continued. But since you didn't, here we are. So make the call. Reed's hands were shaking so badly, he could barely work the phone. It took him 3 tries to find Dana's number in his contacts, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the fact that it wasn't particularly warm in the house. I can't, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. And that's when something inside me snapped. Not into rage. I was still cold, still controlled, still thinking clearly. But into action. Decisive, irreversible action that would make it crystal clear to everyone in this room that I wasn't fucking around anymore. I raised the .45 and put a bullet through Reed's left thigh. The gunshot was even louder this time, if that was possible. The sound seemed to bounce off every surface in the house, a thunderclap of violence that left my ears ringing and the air thick with cordite smoke. Reed's scream was somehow both higher and more guttural than I'd expected, the sound of a man who'd never experienced real pain before and had no idea how to process it. He went down hard, clutching his leg as blood began to seep through his fingers. The phone went skittering across the hardwood floor, coming to rest near Talia's feet. She was screaming too now, high-pitched shrieks that reminded me of a car alarm going off in the distance. "Jesus Christ, Malcolm," she shrieked. "You shot him. You actually shot him." "I did," I agreed calmly, watching Reed writhe on my floor, his blood starting to stain the wood that Talia had spent so much time picking out. "And I'll shoot him again if he doesn't start following instructions." Reed was making noises that weren't quite words, gasping and moaning and generally carrying on like someone had told him he was dying. Which he wasn't. I'd been careful to avoid the femoral artery, and the bullet had gone clean through the muscle. It hurt like hell, no doubt, but it wasn't life-threatening. I wasn't a murderer. Yet. The bullet went through. I explained to both of them, my voice as calm as if I was discussing the weather. Missed the major blood vessels. He'll live, assuming he doesn't go into shock from being a pussy about a little gunshot wound. I walked over to where the phone had landed and picked it up, then tossed it onto Reed's chest. It bounced off and fell beside him on the floor. "Call your wife?" I said again. "Tell her where you'll be." Reed was still gasping and clutching his leg, but he managed to grab the phone with his free hand. His fingers left bloody smears on the screen as he tried to work it. I can't, it hurts." "It's supposed to hurt," I said matter-of-factly. "That's the point. Pain focuses the mind, helps you remember what's important. And what's important right now is that you call Dana and tell her the truth about what kind of man she married." Talia had stopped screaming and was now making these little whimpering sounds, like a puppy that had been kicked. She was staring at the blood on the floor with a look of absolute horror, like she'd never seen anything so shocking in her entire privileged life. "Malcolm," she whispered, "please. This has gone too far. We need to call 911. We need to get him to a hospital." "Oh, we're definitely calling 911, I said, already reaching for my own phone. "But not yet. First, Reed here is going to have a little conversation with his wife. Then he's going to explain to me exactly how many other marriages he's destroyed. And then, only then, am I going to call for an ambulance." I speed-dialed 911, but didn't hit send yet. Just held the phone in my hand like a promise. Or a threat. "This is what's going to happen," I said, my voice calm and reasonable and absolutely terrifying in its measured tone. "I'm going to call the police and tell them there's been a shooting. I'm going to tell them that I came home to find my wife in bed with another man, and that I shot the intruder in self-defense when he threatened me." Reed tried to protest, but all that came out was a strangled wheeze. "I'm going to tell them that Reed here broke into my house, that he attacked me when I confronted him, and that I was forced to defend myself and my property. My word against his. And guess which one of us has a better reputation in this town?" I looked down at Reed, who was still bleeding all over my nice hardwood floors, and smiled. It wasn't a particularly pleasant smile. Of course, if Reed wants to tell a different story, he's welcome to try. But that would mean admitting to adultery, breaking and entering, and destroying multiple families. That would mean explaining to his kids why Daddy is going to prison instead of just going through a messy divorce. I hit send on the 911 call. 911, what's your emergency?" "This is Malcolm Briggs at 1247 North Astor Street," I said, my voice perfectly calm and professional. "I need to report a shooting." An intruder broke into my home and threatened my family. I was forced to defend myself. Are you safe now, sir? Yes, the threat has been neutralized. The intruder is wounded but alive. I'll need an ambulance as well as police response. Units are on the way, sir. Please stay on the line. I looked down at Reed, who was staring up at me with a mixture of pain, fear, and something that might have been respect. Or maybe that was just blood loss making him delusional. You know what the funny thing is? I said to both of them as we waited for the sirens. I was planning to surprise you with a trip to Santorini, Talia. Had the tickets in my briefcase, the hotel booked, even bought you that necklace you wanted. I was going to ask you to renew our vows on the beach where we honeymooned. I shook my head, genuinely amazed by the irony of it all. Instead, I get to watch my marriage bleed out on the living room floor along with your boyfriend. The sirens were getting closer now, their wailing cutting through the evening air like mechanical wolves howling at the moon. Soon this house would be full of paramedics and cops and crime scene techs, all trying to piece together what had happened here. But I already knew what had happened. Justice had happened. Even if their own husbands had forgotten how to protect what was theirs. County jail isn't exactly the Ritz-Carlton, but it wasn't my first rodeo either. As a criminal defense attorney, I'd visited clients in lockup more times than I could count. Hell, I'd probably spent more hours in these concrete corridors than some of the guards. But there's a hell of a difference between walking through those doors with a briefcase and a visitor's badge versus walking through them in handcuffs with your shoelaces confiscated. The irony wasn't lost on me. 24 hours ago, I was Malcolm Briggs, Esquire, respected member of the Chicago Bar Association, owner of a corner office with a view of Lake Michigan. Now I was inmate 47291, sitting on a metal bench in an orange jumpsuit that smelled like industrial disinfectant and other people's desperation. But here's the thing about rock bottom. Once you hit it, you realize it's actually pretty solid ground to build on. And I had some serious building to do. The holding cell was exactly what you'd expect. Gray walls, fluorescent lights that hummed like angry insects, and the kind of silence that makes you think too much. I'd been processed, fingerprinted, photographed, and lectured by 3 different cops about my anger management issues. They'd taken my statement, which matched my 911 call word for word. Some asshole broke into my house, threatened my family, and got exactly what he deserved. Self-defense is a beautiful thing when you know how to sell it properly. The detective who interviewed me was a guy named Morrison, thick-necked and cynical in the way that comes from 20 years of listening to criminals lie to his face. He'd tried every trick in the book to get me to change my story, to admit that maybe I'd overreacted, that maybe shooting an unarmed man wasn't the most reasonable response to finding him in my house. But I hadn't gotten where I was by folding under pressure. I'd stuck to my story like gospel. I came home, found an intruder, felt threatened, defended myself. Period. End of story. The fact that the intruder happened to be screwing my wife was just an unfortunate coincidence that made the whole situation more emotionally charged. Morrison had tried the sympathy angle, the tough guy angle, even though we're both professionals here angle. Nothing worked. Because I knew something he didn't. In about 6 hours, my partner Jerome would post my bail, and I'd walk out of here a free man with a story that would hold up in court. The other inmates gave me a wide berth, which was fine by me. Word travels fast in jail, and apparently shooting a guy for breaking into your house earned you a certain amount of respect. Or maybe it was just that I carried myself like someone who wasn't afraid of the consequences of his actions. Either way, I had plenty of space to think. And thinking was exactly what I needed to do. The wheels in my head had been turning since the moment they'd slapped the cuffs on me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Reed had fucked with the wrong man's life, and now I was going to return the favor with interest. But it had to be done smart, done legal, done in a way that would destroy him completely without giving him any ammunition to use against me. I was still working through the details when a guard came to fetch me. Briggs, you made bail. Jerome was waiting for me in the lobby, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past 24 hours. My law partner was a good man. Hell, he was probably my closest friend, but he wasn't built for this kind of drama. His usually perfect suit was wrinkled, his silver hair was disheveled, and he had the kind of bags under his eyes that came from a sleepless night spent worrying about his partner's sanity. You okay? He asked as we walked toward his BMW, and I could hear genuine concern in his voice. Not yet, I said, because it was the truth. But I will be. Jerome didn't push for details during the drive, which I appreciated. He'd been my partner for 8 years, and he knew me well enough to understand that I'd talk when I was ready. Instead, he filled me in on the practical matters, the media circus that had already formed outside my house, the preliminary hearing scheduled for next week, the fact that Reed was expected to make a full recovery from his unfortunate accident. Talia moved out, he said as we pulled into my driveway. Took what was hers and left. Didn't touch anything that belonged to you. I nodded. Smart girl. The prenup I'd insisted on before we got married was airtight. She'd get what she'd brought into the marriage and not a penny more. 7 years of my life down the drain, but at least she wouldn't profit from the wreckage. Reed was discharged from the ER about an hour ago, Jerome continued. His wife Dana met him with divorce papers and a restraining order. That made me smile. Actually smile, for the first time since this whole nightmare had started. Dana had followed through on her promise, and Reed was about to discover that actions had consequences. Real consequences that couldn't be sweet-talked or charmed away. Good for her, I said. She deserves better than a cheating piece of shit who can't keep his dick in his pants. Jerome glanced at me sideways. What are you planning, Malcolm? I looked at my house. Our house, Talia's and mine, though I supposed it was just mine now, and felt something cold and calculating settle in my chest. Reed thought this was over. He thought taking a bullet in the leg was payment enough for 6 months of destroying my marriage. He thought he could just limp away, lick his wounds, and move on to the next conquest. He was wrong. I'm planning to practice law, I said simply. I'm planning to use every skill I've learned in 15 years of criminal defense work to make sure that Reed understands the full cost of his lifestyle choices. Jerome parked in the driveway and turned to look at me. Malcolm, I know you're hurt. I know you're angry, but I'm not angry anymore. I cut him off and realized it was true. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind something much more dangerous. Purpose. I'm focused. There's a difference. We sat in the car for a moment, both of us staring at the house where my marriage had died, where my old life had ended and something new had begun. Reed thinks this is over, I said finally. He thinks paying the price of a bullet in the leg settles the debt. But he's forgotten something important. What's that? I opened the car door and stepped out into the Chicago evening, breathing in the crisp air and feeling more alive than I had in months. I'm a lawyer, I said, and lawyers don't just fight battles. They win wars. There's nothing quite like the smell of revenge served with a side of freshly brewed coffee. Jerome had arrived at my front door at 7 sharp the next morning, carrying a bag of McDonald's breakfast sandwiches and a cardboard tray with 2 large coffees that probably cost more than some people make in an hour. But it wasn't the food that made me smile. It was the manila folder tucked under his arm, thick with papers and practically vibrating with potential. You look like shit, he said by way of greeting, which was probably accurate. I'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through possibilities and strategies like a chess grandmaster planning 20 moves ahead. I feel fantastic, I replied, and meant it. For the first time in months, maybe years, I had a sense of purpose that went beyond billable hours and client meetings. This was personal. This was justice. This was going to be beautiful. We settled at my kitchen table. The same table where Talia and I used to have our morning coffee and discuss our days, back when I thought I knew what my life was about. That felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 48 hours since my world had imploded in spectacular fashion. Jerome opened the folder and spread its contents across the table like a dealer laying out cards. You were right about Reed, he said, his voice carrying the kind of satisfaction that comes from proving a theory. This bastard has quite the history. The first document he showed me was Reed's employment file from Core-Mark Industries, obtained through what Jerome diplomatically called professional channels. Translation: he'd called in a favor from someone who owed him one, which was how half the legal work in Chicago actually got done. Reed Marshall, Vice President of Business Development. 42 years old, married to Dana for 14 years, 2 kids, lived in a house in Wilmette that was probably worth more than most people's retirement funds. On paper, he looked like every other corporate success story you'd find in the suburbs, the kind of guy who coached Little League on weekends and grilled burgers at block parties. But dig a little deeper, and the picture got a lot more interesting. 3 different women, Jerome said. pointing to a series of incident reports that had been buried so deep in the company files they might as well have been classified. 3 separate accusations of sexual harassment over the past 5 years. All of them settled quietly, all of them covered up by Core-Mark's legal department. I picked up the first report, dated 3 years ago. Sarah Chun, marketing coordinator, age 26. She'd accused Reed of persistent, unwanted advances, inappropriate touching during business trips, and creating a hostile work environment. The complaint had been filed, investigated by an internal team that was clearly more interested in protecting the company than the victim, and ultimately resolved with a confidential settlement that probably included enough zeros to buy Sarah's silence. The second report was similar. Jennifer Walsh, sales associate, age 29. Same pattern of behavior, same internal investigation, same quiet settlement that made the problem disappear without addressing the root cause. The third was the most recent, filed just 8 months ago. Lisa Rodriguez, executive assistant, age 31. Her complaint was more detailed, more explicit, and included text messages and emails that painted Reed as exactly the kind of predator I'd suspected him to be from the moment I'd seen him stumbling down my stairs. Son of a bitch, I muttered, reading through Lisa's statement. Reed had apparently used his position of authority to coerce sexual favors, promising promotions and threatening career consequences depending on how cooperative his targets were. It was textbook sexual harassment, the kind of behavior that should have gotten him fired and probably prosecuted. Instead, Core-Mark had paid Lisa a settlement that was reportedly in the mid-6 figures and transferred her to a different department where she wouldn't have to interact with Reed. Problem solved, at least from the company's perspective. It gets better, Jerome said, pulling out another set of documents. Guess who provided us with copies of all this? I looked up from Lisa's complaint, intrigued. Getting access to sealed personnel files and confidential settlements wasn't easy, even for lawyers with connections. Dana, Jerome said with a grin that was pure predator. Reed's soon-to-be ex-wife. Turns out she works in HR at Core-Mark. Has for the past 6 years. And she's been keeping her own files on her husband's extracurricular activities. That was beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Dana hadn't just been playing the role of oblivious wife. She'd been documenting Reed's behavior, building a case against him one incident at a time. And now she was ready to use that ammunition in ways that Reed never saw coming. She came to the office yesterday afternoon, Jerome continued. Walked in with 2 boxes of documents and a story that would make your blood boil. Apparently, she's known about Reed's affairs for years, but she stayed quiet for the kids' sake. Your phone call was the final straw. I could picture it. Dana sitting in our conference room, her marriage falling apart around her, finally ready to stop protecting the man who'd been systematically destroying other women's careers while he destroyed their marriage. There was something poetic about the timing, like the universe had decided that Reed's bill had finally come due. What does she want? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Full custody of the kids. Alimony that reflects Reed's actual earning potential. And she wants Reed to face consequences for what he's done to those women at Core-Mark. Jerome pulled out another document, this one with the Core-Mark Industries letterhead at the top. She also brought us this, Reed's morality clause. I scanned the contract language, feeling my smile grow wider with every paragraph. Like most executives at major corporations, Reed's employment agreement included a morality clause that allowed the company to terminate him for conduct that brought disrepute to the organization. Adultery, sexual harassment, creating liability for the company, all grounds for immediate dismissal without severance. The company doesn't know about the affair yet, Jerome said. They don't know that Reed was using company time and company resources to conduct his relationship with your wife. They don't know that their VP has been having unprotected sex with a married woman, creating potential liability issues if STDs or pregnancy had been involved. The wheels in my head were spinning so fast I could practically feel the heat from the friction. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice. Real justice, the kind that came with consequences that lasted longer than a bullet wound. Dana wants to testify, Jerome continued. She's willing to go on record about Reed's pattern of behavior, his history of affairs, his complete disregard for his marriage vows, and his professional responsibilities. She's also willing to provide testimony about the financial arrangements Reed made to keep his other victims quiet. I sat back in my chair, looking at the spread of documents across my kitchen table. Employment files, settlement agreements, internal memos, email printouts, financial records. It was like Christmas morning for a lawyer with a grudge. "There's more," Jerome said, reaching into his briefcase. "I made some calls yesterday. Turns out Reed's reputation in the industry isn't quite as sterling as his LinkedIn profile would suggest. Word is that Core-Mark has been looking for an excuse to get rid of him for months. Seems he's been taking credit for other people's work, padding his expense reports, and generally being the kind of executive that makes companies nervous about their liability exposure." He handed me a printout of an email chain between Core-Mark's CEO and their head of legal. The subject line read, "Reed Marshall, Liability Assessment." "They've been building a case against him," Jerome explained, "looking for a way to terminate him without triggering a wrongful dismissal lawsuit. They just needed the right ammunition." I looked at the pile of evidence on my table, enough ammunition to destroy Reed's career, his marriage, his reputation, and his financial security, all in one coordinated strike. It was more than I'd dared to hope for when I'd first started planning my counterattack. "So what's our move?" Jerome asked. I picked up my coffee and took a long sip, savoring both the caffeine and the moment. Reed had thought he could walk into my life, destroy my marriage, and walk away with nothing more than a limp to remind him of his mistakes. He'd underestimated the consequences of fucking with a man who'd spent 15 years learning how to destroy people legally and professionally. "We're going to war," I said simply. "And we're going to win it so completely that Reed will spend the rest of his life wishing he'd never learned my wife's name." Jerome's grin matched mine. "I was hoping you'd say that. It was going to be a beautiful day. There's something deeply satisfying about walking into a corporate headquarters with enough legal firepower to level the building." Core-Mark Industries occupied 30 floors of prime Chicago real estate, all glass and steel, and the kind of modern architecture that screamed, "We have more money than God." The lobby was all marble and chrome, with abstract sculptures that probably cost more than most people's houses and a reception desk that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. Jerome and I walked through those polished doors like we owned the place, which in a way, we were about to. I was carrying a leather briefcase that contained enough documentation to destroy Reed's career and probably take a good chunk of Core-Mark's reputation down with him. Jerome had a matching case filled with legal papers that would make the company's lawyers weep into their expensive scotch. We looked good, professional, dangerous in the way that only lawyers carrying damning evidence can look dangerous. The elevator ride to the 30th floor gave me time to admire the view and think about how much I was going to enjoy the next hour. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago spread out below us like a kingdom waiting to be conquered. Somewhere out there, Reed was probably nursing his wounded leg and thinking the worst was behind him. Poor bastard had no idea the real war was just beginning. Patrick Sloan's corner office was exactly what you'd expect from a CEO who'd built his company from the ground up. Expensive furniture, awards covering the walls, and a view that probably added $1 million to the rent. Sloan himself was in his 50s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, the kind of man who'd clawed his way to the top and knew how to spot trouble from a mile away. He tried to be polite when his secretary ushered us in, offered coffee, asked about our drive downtown, made the kind of small talk that CEOs use to size up potential threats. But I could see the wariness in his eyes. When two lawyers show up unannounced at your corporate headquarters carrying briefcases and wearing expressions that could cut glass, it's never good news. "Gentlemen," Sloan said, settling behind his massive desk like it was a fortress wall. "What can I do for you today?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. Time for playing games was over. "Your VP is a predator," I said, my voice flat and matter-of-fact. "And your company has been enabling it." The color drained from Sloan's face like someone had pulled a plug. He tried to maintain his composure, but I'd been reading people's reactions in courtrooms for 15 years. I knew guilt when I saw it. "I'm not sure what you're." "Reed Marshall." Jerome cut him off, opening his briefcase with the kind of theatrical flair that comes from years of courtroom drama. 3 separate sexual harassment complaints over the past 5 years. All buried by your legal department. All settled with company money to buy silence. We'd rehearsed this presentation like a Broadway show, timing it for maximum impact. While Jerome was talking, I was pulling documents from my own case and spreading them across Sloane's polished desk like evidence in a murder trial. Sarah Chun, Jennifer Walsh, Lisa Rodriguez, I said, placing each woman's complaint in front of him. 3 victims that we know about. God knows how many others decided not to report because they saw how your company handled these cases. Sloane stared at the papers like they were poisonous snakes. These matters were resolved internally. These matters were covered up, I corrected, swept under the rug to protect a serial predator who's been using his posy of his morality clause, creating potential liability for hostile workplace lawsuits from multiple victims. We're talking about a pattern of behavior that could cost your company millions in damages. Sloane was no fool. He'd built Core-Mark from nothing into a billion-dollar enterprise, and he hadn't done it by being sentimental about employees who threatened the company's bottom line. I could practically see him adding up the numbers: legal fees, settlement costs, regulatory investigations, damage to the company's reputation. "What do you want?" he asked, and those 4 words told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't going to fight us. He wasn't going to defend Reed. He was ready to cut his losses and move on. But I wasn't ready to make it that easy for him. "Reed destroyed my marriage," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "He violated my home, my wife, my life. He thought he could walk away from that with nothing more than a bullet scar to show for it." I pulled out one final document, a lawsuit that Jerome and I had drafted the night before, comprehensive enough to destroy both Reed and Core-Mark if we chose to file it. Hostile workplace environment, corporate negligence, failure to protect employees from known predators, conspiracy to cover up criminal behavior. I let each charge hang in the air like smoke from a fired gun. We could file this today and watch your stock price crater while the media has a field day with Reed's history of sexual harassment. Sloane tried to negotiate, offering smaller settlements, alternative arrangements, anything to minimize the damage. But I learned a long time ago that you never negotiate from a position of strength. You dictate terms. 7 figures, I said simply. Public apologies to Reed's victims. Full cooperation in any criminal investigation. And Reed's immediate termination with forfeiture of all benefits and severance. The silence in that office was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Sloane stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time, recognizing that I wasn't just some cuckolded husband looking for revenge. I was a predator who'd found wounded prey, and I was going to extract every pound of flesh the law would allow. His silence cost more than he ever expected. I continued, standing up and straightening my tie. Reed thought screwing another man's wife was a victimless crime. Today he learns about consequences. Sloane reached for his phone, probably to call his legal department and start damage control. But the war was already over. Reed just didn't know it yet. As Jerome and I walked back through that marble lobby, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not satisfaction, that would come later. This was anticipation, the sweet knowledge that justice was about to be served with interest. Reed had started this war when he walked into my house and into my wife's bed. But I was going to finish it in ways he never saw coming. The view from this Santorini balcony is absolutely breathtaking. 3 years after my life exploded, I'm sitting where Talia and I were supposed to celebrate our anniversary, and I've never been happier. The irony tastes sweeter than the expensive wine in my glass. This villa costs more per week than most people earn monthly, but destroying Reed's life turned out to be surprisingly profitable. The 7-figure settlement from Core-Mark was just the beginning. Dana passed the bar last month. Dana Rowe again. She dropped Marshall the day her divorce finalized. At 36, she juggled law school with single motherhood, driven by determination that was beautiful to witness. She heads our family law division now, fierce and focused, protecting other women from men like her ex-husband. We're colleagues, maybe something more someday, but there's no rush. Reed? Last I heard, he's selling used cars at some strip mall outside St. Louis. The mighty have fallen hard. Between wrongful termination suits, workplace settlements, and divorce proceedings, he lost everything. House, country club membership, respect. His kids live with Dana full-time. He gets every other weekend, if he can afford gas money from Missouri. Beautiful part? It was all perfectly legal. No vigilante justice, just systematic consequences through proper channels. Reed built his life on lies and exploitation, assuming actions wouldn't have repercussions. Wrong assumption. Talia moved to California after our divorce. The prenup held. She got what she brought, nothing more. I rarely think about her now. Where love and anger once lived, there's just emptiness. Not bitter, not sad. Just nothing. The practice is thriving. Taking down corporate predators makes excellent advertising. Jerome and I hired 3 associates, considering a second office. Sometimes revenge isn't destroying enemies. It's rebuilding yourself so completely they become irrelevant footnotes in your success story. The phone call came while I was watching the sunset from my terrace in Santorini, a glass of wine in one hand, and the peaceful satisfaction of a man who'd rebuilt his life exactly the way he wanted it. Jerome's voice crackled through the international connection, carrying news that should have hit me harder than it did. Talia came by the office today, he said without preamble. She looked rough, Malcolm. Really rough. I took a slow sip of wine, watching the sun sink toward the horizon like a golden coin dropped into the sea. What did she want? She's sick. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Maybe 6 months left, according to her doctors. She wanted to see you. Wanted to. Jerome's voice trailed off, searching for the right words. She wanted to make amends, I think. Asked me to give her your number. I should have felt something at that news. Shock, sadness, maybe even a flicker of the love I'd once carried for her. Instead, there was just a quiet emptiness where those emotions used to live, like an old wound that had healed so completely it didn't even ache anymore. I told her I'd pass along the message, but couldn't give out your contact information without your permission, Jerome continued. What do you want me to tell her? The answer came without hesitation, clear and final as the sound of waves against the cliffs below. Tell her no. Malcolm. Tell her no, Jerome. I'm not interested in deathbed confessions or last-minute apologies. She made her choices 3 years ago, and I've made mine. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jerome had been my partner and friend for over a decade, had seen me through the worst period of my life, and he understood better than anyone how completely I'd moved beyond the wreckage of my marriage. Are you sure? She seemed genuinely remorseful. I'm sure. I set down my wine glass and leaned back in my chair, feeling nothing but peace with the decision. Talia had her path, Jerome. She chose it freely, knowing the consequences. I had mine, and I chose it just as deliberately. Some stories don't need a final chapter. That night, after Jerome hung up, I sat under the Santorini stars thinking about closure and what it actually means. Most people think closure has to be loud. Dramatic confrontations, tearful apologies, grand gestures of forgiveness or revenge. But sometimes the deepest kind of closure is quiet, subtle, as simple as realizing that someone who once meant everything to you has become just another stranger whose problems are no longer your concern. Talia was dying, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction at her suffering, not grief for what we'd lost, not even curiosity about what she might have wanted to say. She'd become a footnote in the story of my life, relevant only as the catalyst that had pushed me towards something better. The man who'd sat in that recliner 3 years ago, gun in his lap and heart full of rage, would probably have taken her call, would have listened to her apologies, maybe even offered forgiveness in her final months. But that man was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more selective about who deserved access to his emotional energy. I raised my glass to the Mediterranean sky, toasting not Talia's impending death, but my own rebirth. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone else. It's about rebuilding yourself so completely that they become irrelevant to your happiness. And sometimes the sweetest victory is simply not caring anymore.